Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 2nd of February 2026. Environmental regulation is one of the key tools the government is using to support the aims of its Environmental Improvement Plan, brackets EIP. One of the aims of this plan is to include streamlining regulation to both safeguard nature and drive economic growth. However, progress so far has been mixed, with the Office for Environmental Protection finding last month that government is likely to achieve only 5 of its 43 environmental targets and commitments. The NAO's report on this subject also found that the two largest environmental regulators, the Environment Agency, EA, and Natural England, NE, face several challenges to regulating efficiently and effectively. These regulators responded to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, are sponsored by DEFRA. Today we'll be looking to assess the Department's readiness to address the challenges and potential significant reforms ahead. We will also be examining how well DEFRA and its regulators are supporting businesses to comply with the rules and understand how they are planning to target their regulatory work more effectively. So, welcome everybody. I think that if the witnesses would like to introduce themselves, starting with you, Permanent Secretary, please, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Paul Kissack. I'm the Permanent Secretary at DEFRA.
Thank you. Perhaps then go to Sally Randall.
Good afternoon. I'm Sally Randall. I'm Director General Environment at DEFRA.
Welcome. Starting next with you, Philip, please.
I'm Phil Duffy. I am the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency.
And I'm Marian Spain, Chief Executive of Natural England.
Very good. Now, I think that especially a warm welcome, forgive me if I've got this wrong, this is what my note says, that you, Marian, and Paul, we've already said, your first time in front of the PAC in your new role as Permanent Secretary, so a warm welcome to both of you. Sally and Philip, I know Philip has, and I think, Sally, you have been before the committee as well. Well done. Special warm welcome to all of you. I'm going to start by declaring my interests as in the register of members' interest as a farmer, as a charter surveyor, and as a chairman of the All-Party Shooting and Conservation Group. Any other members wish to declare any interests? Rupert Lowe.
I should declare, Chairman, that I am, amongst other things, an active farmer, and therefore come into regular contact with the departments that these fine people run.
I don't know whether you're more active than I am, but anyway, we're both active farmers. Good. Thank you. Yes, sorry, and I'm very sorry.
Yes, and in addition to my cousin having a family farm, but that's quite removed, the main conflict I wish to declare is that I also personally know Dan Corrie, who's obviously author of one of the independent reviews on environmental regulation for DEFRA that we're looking at, and I believe he's also a member of your board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I think we are going to start with you, please.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for coming in to speak to us. Obviously, there's been a number of reviews. The Corrie review that I've just mentioned. In addition, the so-called Cunliffe review, which was the independent review of the water industry, which obviously not only touched on Ofwat, who've been in for a previous hearing here in front of the Public Accounts Committee, but also on some of the responsibilities of the Environment Agency. And we also understand there's been an internal review that DEFRA itself has had of its own management and leadership of its arm's-length bodies. Across these 3 reviews, there are some 149 recommendations to DEFRA. So why did it take all of these reviews to identify what's not working when it comes to environmental regulation? And perhaps, Paul, you'd like to start.
Yeah, thanks very much. So you're right. I think over the last sort of several months, we've had a number of important reviews. I'd actually also add to that list with the Fingleton review on nuclear as well, which I think may have come out after or around the same time as the NAO report. And actually, the NAO report itself, we consider a further review, which is helpful in this context. So we've got a lot of analysis about what is going right and wrong. I think it's worth stating one of the most important conclusions from all of these reviews, or one of the starting points for each of them, which bears repeating, is the importance of environmental regulation, both for environmental outcomes but also for public health outcomes as well. A lot of the regulations that we are responsible for are around human health as well as the health of the environment. I also think one of the sort of common conclusions across the reviews is that the regulatory system is achieving some good outcomes, but actually it is not achieving as good a set of outcomes as we'd want either for the environment or indeed for the economy and economic growth. I think all of the reports touch on the importance of us being more outcomes focused rather than process focused. There is a tendency in the way in which we work as regulators and departments where we become overly focused on process, and there is something about how we shift the system to be more focused on the outcomes that we want and that government and indeed Parliament want are set out in legislation. That does require us to work in a different way. I think some of the themes that come through, and no doubt we'll come on to different elements of them, there is something about accountability. You know, how do we hold ourselves to account, and how does Parliament hold us to account for outcomes as well as performance on inputs and activity? Are we being creative enough in terms of coming up with solutions to difficult challenges? And there are difficult challenges and trade-offs that come up. Questions about risk. A lot of the reports talk about risk aversion. The NAO report itself talks about risk aversion. So how do we shift in that culture? A greater focus on the customer. Again, I think there are areas where we are getting this right and we are getting it better, but there are certainly areas where we have a lot more to do in terms of being properly customer focused. Levels of complexity is another one. Dan Corrie talks about 3,000 regulations. They have grown up over time. There is a lot of complexity. And then there's a final issue, I think, around sort of consistency and predictability of regulator behaviour. So, I mean, there are lots of things within the 149, as you say, recommendations. But if I was trying to pull out sort of key themes, they would be the ones that I point to.
And I think, as you say, we'll be coming to a number of those, not least that one on complexity or simplicity with those 3,000 separate pieces of legislation. If you're on the receiving end of some of that, it certainly can feel quite overwhelming and burdensome, as we'll come to. But I would actually like to give opportunity particularly to, are you Phil or Philip, and to Marian. There's a lot in these reports that relates not to just to the department, but to you specifically as regulators responsible for implementation. So what's the top lesson that you take specifically from these different reviews that we've just highlighted?
I think the first thing I'd say is it's great to see the NAO recognising here that we are really focused in the EA on improving our regulatory professionalism. I would not say that job is complete, neither do the NAO, but we are starting a real process to bring that consistency and rigour in how we regulate and raising the standards and professional skills of our staff who do that regulation. And it's worth noting in that regard how many of the biggest regimes we run, water is one, with our 10,000 inspection target this year. Farming rules for water is another that's only really bedding over the last 4 years. These are quite new regimes, and trying to establish them, trying to target them, trying to really understand the data behind them is a new endeavour for us. And that's in stark contrast to our more established regimes, like our nuclear work, for example. I think the second thing I want to say is that we would completely endorse the findings of many of the reviews you just mentioned. In fact, we were heavily consulted in preparing them. As regulators, we also want more discretion. We also want clearer guidance. We also want people to tackle some of the very obsolete legislation we have to work within. And doing that is the way we can unlock some of these difficult problems. And if you look at where regulation gets very stuck, it's because our frontline staff actually are trying to reconcile a whole range of different conflicting agendas and find that extremely challenging. So a lot there we'd agree with on this, and I think we're very supportive of the NAO's findings that over the next couple of years our priority should be bringing more consistency to how we do that, which we're doing in the EA by introducing a whole series of control strategies that have consistent data behind them and consistent approaches to how we regulate.
So some of your failings to, for example, on water pollution, which is something you raised there, are you sort of blaming the fact that you've not had clear guidance or you've had too many competing and conflicting agendas, or do you take some responsibility for actually, having not done
You will have heard me say on appointment that when I arrived in the Environment Agency nearly 3 years ago, we only had 91 staff working on water pollution in that sense. We now have about 500. We've had support from successive governments to expand that work. And to my colleague's point, Mr. Kissack's point about regulation working, I think you can see that the very deregulatory stance that was taken towards wastewater in particular did not work very well. I mean, we are now publishing all of our inspection reports. You can find them on a map, so you can see your local community's results, and there are very troubling things in that data. In the last year, around about a quarter of inspections the EA undertook of wastewater treatment works were in some way non-compliant. often not very seriously non-compliant, but if you don't clear a trash screen, for example, more sewage will go into a watercourse than is planned for. And that's an example of how, actually, now we're doing that, we're publishing that, we are seeing a response from water companies. The latest data I've got shows that last year we were doing about 4,500 inspections. Then about nearly 7% of cases we saw very serious breaches that could lead to prosecution. This year it's down to about 3.5%. Bit early to declare victory on that, but I would say it's a good example of how that form of sustained, consistent inspection of what these companies are doing can drive better performance.
I mean, obviously, knowing that it's happening is the first and enforcement is the second, but I will come back to this, I'm sure. I want to give Marian an opportunity to answer the same question, which is, what do you take as the top priority for your regulator from the various reports that have taken place?
So perhaps just to echo what my colleagues said, I think we very much welcome those various reports and the NEO report. They were being developed at the same time as Natural England was doing a fundamental reset of its own organisational strategy, so we were able to iterate together. And I think the 2 or 3 things that we are particularly focused on is that being clear on the outcomes we're trying to achieve, that clarity as to why society, the economy, our national resilience needs a healthy environment and thriving nature, so that helps us to really focus how we regulate. I think the other thing I might say, and I suspect we'll return to this theme throughout the afternoon as well, regulatory reform is not a once and done job. This has been a continuous system of improvement, and I think we'll be continuing to improve. I think once we have finished the immediate action plans, more issues will come up. And that's partly, again, because of how society is currently reacting to nature and the environment. We will need to change our approach to nuance our outcomes. And, of course, we're working in a system that is complex in its own right. Ecosystems are complex. They can't be done by a single regulatory intervention. And that's perhaps a final theme I'll mention that we might return to. The other reason we are continuously looking at how we regulate it is by no means the only tool any of us, the department or the regulators, use to achieve those environmental outcomes.
I recognise that the Permanent Secretary, you're quite new in the department, but I think, Sally, you've been there a bit longer in your role. So, again, I mean, I'm sure many of the things in these reviews were familiar to you, but clearly it does point somewhat towards DEFRA and your, I guess, ability or not to offer strategic leadership of environmental regulation with making sure that your ALBs and the regulators are coordinated and aligned and ultimately taking accountability. So what do you take as the top priority that, you as a department recognise where you may have fallen short and need to change?
I think one of the things that these reviews all say in some way is that we need to draw a stronger connection between the activities that we ask our regulators to undertake and the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And that's something that we have been strengthening over a number of years since the original 25-year environment strategy in 2021, and we've just published a new environmental improvement plan, which I think for the first time sets out a really clear set of connections between that regulatory activity, the role that we expect it to play in delivering on outcomes, and as Marian says, how it sits alongside other activities. And that for us is a real sort of cornerstone of the direction that we can then give to our arm's length bodies to say, these are the things that we need you to prioritise alongside when we come on to publish strategic policy statements, as we hope to soon, or when our ministers write to chief executives setting out their expectations, also saying this is the approach, this is the stance that we expect you to take in your regulation. This is where we want you to be flexible. This is where we want you to take a robust approach. So I think having that really clear connection between the activity of the regulators and the outcomes that we want to deliver, something that we've been working on for some time, but comes out quite clearly, I think, in all of those reports. It certainly does in Dan Corrie's review, and it does the advice we've got from Heather Hancock, and I think it's in the others too.
I'll leave it there, Chair, for others to
follow.
You want
to ask your further question on risk now, or would you like to do it later?
I think it's fine. I think it's coming up later.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. I now pass my excellent Deputy Clive Betts, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Clearly there's big challenges around currently and pressures on the work you have to do. Then coming down the track is a lot more change, a lot more alteration, probably legislation, changing the framework, how you operate. Have you got the skills and resources to deliver what you do now, and also to then take on board all the new challenges that are going to be facing you in the next few years? Secretary, you want to begin?
So, I mean, I've been in the department for 3 months. I think there are lots of areas we need to improve. There are areas to strengthen. But overall, I would say the answer to your question is yes. So we've got a set of big reform agendas. We've talked, we're starting to get into some of them, whether that's around the environmental improvement plan, whether it's around the water reforms, which I know you were talking to witnesses about a week or so ago. We've got a big set of changes likely, depending on where we get to in terms of negotiations with the European Union around SBS. And actually, later this year we'll be setting out a farming roadmap as well, which all of these things help to tilt DEFRA, I think, towards greater clarity on its strategic outcomes, which I think, as we were just talking about, is one of the things that has been underplayed. When I look at the capacity within the department, I think we do have the capacity to do that. I think we're set up increasingly to oversee these as a set of discrete programmes. But also we have sort of cross-cutting capability as well. So we do have a director-led group looking at how we are undertaking regulatory reform across the piece. I think if I was to think about a sort of where we have historically lacked skills, it would be in digital and data. One of the things we may come on to is the NEO's conclusion that we're not moving fast enough on that. But even there, I think we have made quite substantial progress over the last couple of years. So I think you're quite right. There's a very big agenda of change. If I'm honest, I've never worked in a government department which didn't have a very big agenda of change, and I wouldn't want to, actually. But my overall sense is that the department is well set up to deliver this, both in terms of the core department and in terms of the main arm's length bodies.
Right. Two agencies?
Shall I go first this time? So we have also invested in our ability to run change. We've set up a new programme management and change management unit led by our director. We've organised our work under 4 big critical reforms that the report refers to. I think the other thing that also gives me some comfort that we can prioritise, because we can't do all of the changes all at once, but the way we are prioritising, the changes we are making first, are the ones that will produce both benefits for customers through simplification and clarity. They will also often bring benefits for us. If it is easier and quicker for our customers, it's easier and quicker for us, so we can contribute to our efficiency targets. And they are also often the changes that have the greatest impact on nature, because we are better able, as a result of the reforms we're putting in place, to focus where there are big risks and big opportunities. So again, without repeating my previous answer, we will be constantly looking at the volume of change we have, prioritising within it, and looking at the things where we will make the biggest difference.
Environment Agency?
Well, first of all, since 2010, the EA has grown considerably. It's gone from around 10,000 FTE to nearly 13,500. It's taken on lots of new functions, but it's also had quite generous settlements from DEFRA on IT over that period, and the total sum of money between both SRs is about 190 million. So it's very hard for us to say we haven't got the resources we would need to make the changes we're looking for. What we do have, a slightly more finer grain of it, is a small number of very, very technical skills that are hard for us to fill. And we've had to invest very heavily in improving our general IT capacity and our service transformation capacity. And like Marian, what we're trying to do is put the service user, the citizen, the correspondent, the person wanting a permit at the heart of how we think about our services. Can they have an easier experience of what that looked like? And that is an area where we've been slow, and we're trying to desperately improve our performance on those areas. So that's things like automating forms, removing paper forms, making sure our customer services are quicker, simplifying guidance, all those areas. So I think we have got the skills, and we have the structures now, but as the NEO find, we've got a long way to go in some of these areas.
That wouldn't necessarily be the experience of my constituents, I have to say, about whether you've got the capacity to do what you're supposed to be doing now. And very often it's also that you're reactive. You're not looking ahead, you're not seeing a general plan. And just some examples, we'll probably come on to farming later as a specific issue. But my constituency, farms, that's a couple of farms, but it's down to older industrial areas, often small bits of workshops that are then occupied by illegal car repairers, by others, scrap metal dealers who are not following the rules, firms who are creating pollution through dust in the environment. Trying to get your people along to engage is sometimes difficult. When they do, they can be very good and very effective. But also, it's always having to come and get you. Not that you seem to have a plan and a strategy going forward.
So I'm sorry to hear you've struggled to get hold of us in your constituency. We have 100,000 incidents last year reported to us, and the single message I'd have for anyone is, if there is an incident, please tell us. We are not some omniscient organisation that knows about every single site across the country, and we are trying to target our resources in areas where we have the greatest risk. Now, at this point, you might say, well, Mr. Duffy, do you not want more people working in some of these areas? And of course I would like that, because the demand for our services is extremely high, particularly in waste. I think you were going to come on to risk, Ms. Dixon, but I think one of the issues for the Environment Agency that it has to tackle very seriously is whether it should take more risk, particularly in waste, in closing sites that have long-running problems. So to give you a sense of the scale of that, we categorise waste sites A through to F. And it strikes me that you shouldn't be in the bottom 3 bands year after year without something being done. And actually, as of last year, we had about 460 sites across the UK who have been in that category for more than 1 year. And my challenge to my own staff is, can we take a few risks, and can we say, if you don't comply, if you don't improve your management of dust or noise or comply with your permit, you are at risk of having your permit first of all suspended and secondarily revoked. Now, we have revoked some permits recently. It's a new thing for us. We revoked at Wadders Quarry in Stoke-upon-Trent. It was a very risky thing for us to do. I think it was the right thing to do because it was meeting expectations of that community who over many years had experienced noise and disruption to their areas. Around the country, you know, other colleagues have got, well, we've got long-standing issues with very non-compliant sectors. In some cases, those people are going into criminality, and there's a limit to what we can do as an environmental permitting area. But in other areas, a revocation of the permit would be appropriate, and it would nip that in the bud. So I've got some sympathy with the direction you're going in, Mr. Betts, and I think we could do more on that agenda.
Some sympathy with and going...
A lot of sympathy with it, because I think I see it from the point of view of constituents who are putting up with noise and smell time and time again. One of the things that comes up elsewhere is it right that we do so much inspection of the permitted sites? It is, because permitted sites are a principal source of people's complaint. 40,000 last year of the 100,000 calls we took were about smell and disruption from permitted waste sites. That's a lot across the country. We do need to make sure, though, that we've got the legal backing capacity to deal with what can be a very litigious process in closing sites that are non-compliant.
I've raised the point about being a bit more proactive.
Yeah.
When there are clear examples in an area, to go in and actually start inspecting some of these sites. They won't have permits. They don't operate like that.
So are you saying, what do we do about illegal sites that have no permit?
Well, car repairers, where the cars are being repaired in the middle of the road. Yeah. I mean, this is clearly an issue, an environmental issue, as well as issues for other organisations. And I suppose the follow-on question is your ability to work with other organisations. In that case, it's the council, it's the DVLA, it's the police. You don't know how long it takes to get all those organisations together at the same time.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think in our current corporate strategy, we talk about putting the citizen at the heart of what we do, caring about the community. And I have seen examples, in all frankness, where you see other agencies passing things around between them, and we should stop that. We have good partnerships with the LRFs, the local resilience fora around the country. We should be plugged in with local government and the other partners. We've seen that work well in many, many areas. I think your question is getting into illegal waste sites that are not permitted. That is a more complex question because as we're the permitter, if we have an out-and-out illegal site where there is no permit, there are a different set of issues to be dealt with there.
Yeah, but illegal car repairers, you don't permit them.
Exactly.
In fact, they shouldn't be permitted. That's the issue is, I'm just trying to get at, have you got the resources to actually engage proactively and talk to all these other organisations? You don't know how hard it is to get your staff and the DVLA together at the same time.
Right.
On site.
I mean, 9,500 of our staff live and work in constituencies right the way around England. Right? We are one of the very few genuinely regionalised organisations in England. We have 190 offices. And your business as well. And we are present in your constituencies. We understand those partners. We work with them very well. There are times, perhaps cars is one of them, where there are gaps in the regulatory provision. We should talk about that. And we would always like to have more resources. But the truth is what we need to do as leaders is get the best out of the teams we've got. They work incredibly hard around the country. And they are focused on delivering for your citizens.
Okay, I'll finish that. It would be helpful if you say there are gaps, if you could let us know what the gaps are and what needs to be done to bridge them, put them right.
I mean, illegal car recycling might be one of them.
Okay, perhaps you could have a note on what should be done to deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Following up Clive's question, Mr. Duffy, if I may, the illegal sites are almost worse than the legal ones. And there have been recent reports of this one in Oxfordshire where you were criticised for being too slow to act. Do you want to comment on that and say what you can do to improve? If somebody's creating a huge site, you should be in there pretty quickly stopping them, shouldn't you?
Thank you. Look, I mean, the question of illegal waste sites is broader than the Environment Agency. We are here to permit sites. We have, over the last 3 years, set up functions to help tackle illegal sites, criminality in the waste system. We had them 10 years ago, we lost them, we've rebuilt them now. They're quite new functions. On Kidlington specifically, it's an interesting story because we actually didn't get confirmed intelligence on Kidlington until the 30th of June last year. We were on site, I think, on the 2nd of July, and we took immediate action. In fact, when we got to the site, the people with the diggers ran off. So we have some particularly clear examples of us turning up does have an effect, and I'm pleased to report to the committee we made our fourth arrest in that case this morning. But the local community tell me that they had seen suspicious activity on that site for many weeks previously. So there's clearly a gap there in getting the intelligence from whoever has got it to the people who can take action fast enough. Elsewhere around the country, we've just introduced a checklist to make sure that we have a consistent approach to illegal waste sites. We cannot, once they're there, it's not our job to clear them, but we can make sure we show up quickly, do the environmental assessment of risk. Is there a flood risk? Is there a fire risk, for example? And consider more routinely whether we can put blocks around the site and exclude them. We can't always, and actually often, and it varies around the country, fire services are very nervous about that because they want to make sure they've got access to the site to deal with a fire, and these sites can catch fire. So we're trying to be as robust and quick on that area. What I feel we have to do on illegal waste sites, though, is go upstream, because this waste at Kidlington had been trommelled, shredded, it had the metal removed, and the question we've been asking is, where was that waste processing done? Where did this waste come from? Was there corruption further upstream in the waste process that allowed this genuinely appalling thing to take place?
So, would we sort of get out of this session very clearly that if a member of the public gets hold of your team, they will at least get an answer as to whether the site is illegal, whether it's permitted or not, and what action is being taken?
It's such an important point, and we've just actually changed how we're handling illegal waste site intelligence flows to make sure they're not emailed, they are rung through to the staff. They can do that triage. Now, quite often we already know about it, or we have another agency there. But if it's a completely new site to us, then we need to be asking more questions faster.
Thank you very much indeed. Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'd like to just go back to the beginning a little, please. So when I read the NAO report entitled Environmental Regulation, concluded that DEFRA's largest environmental regulators, the Environment Agency and Natural England, face several challenges to regulating efficiently and effectively. These include the constraints of the regulatory framework they operate within, a lack of strategic support from DEFRA, outdated IT systems, data limitations, and a risk-averse culture. So forgive me, but I'm from business. If I read that in a board report, I'd say, should we be starting again with a clean piece of paper? So should we be starting with a clean sheet of paper? Are you able to put this right?
I don't think we do need to start with a clean sheet of paper, is what I'd say. And actually, whilst that is a challenging view, rightly so, and a fair view, I think, of where we're at when I look at the system coming in, we are actually in a better place than we would have been 2 or 3 years ago when, if you look back at the NAO report from 2023, which I did, we've actually made quite a lot of progress. And the NAO recognises the progress that has been made, and indeed some of the systems that we have set up since. So, as ever, this is never going to be a finished entity. Regulatory reform and improving the regulatory system, responding to customer feedback, getting better IT, as you all know, it's from the private sector, is a constant piece of work and change for us. On the first point that you raised about the limitations of the underlying regulatory framework that EA and NE are asked to implement, what I'd say is that in essence what we have is a rolling programme to review and evaluate the legislative basis on which EA and NE do their work. So in many respects, I think you could see the reports that we were talking about earlier as examples of taking a systematic look at different chunks of the regulatory framework, be that water or other elements that Dan Corrie looked at. very often on the back of that, I should say we've also done over 100 post-implementation reviews of different parts of the legislation. I think when my predecessor appeared here 3 years ago, there was a large backlog of 60-odd post-implementation reviews that has now been cleared, I think with the exception of one or two. We've actually done over 100 post-implementation reviews, and in around a third of those, we find that we do actually need to make some substantive change. Now, that takes a number of forms. So sometimes, of course, that will be a primary legislative change, the outcome from the Independent Water Commission, the setting up of the new regulator, the commitment to consolidating the underpinning legislative framework around the environmental regulations. That will be primary legislative change. The Planning and Infrastructure Act that has just gone through, again, primary legislative change. We also always have a very active programme of secondary legislative change. I think DEFRA took through between 60 and 70 SIs last year. We will have a very active rolling programme of secondary legislation in the coming session as well.
Is this a long way of saying we don't need to start with a clean sheet of paper?
It is.
Is that what you're telling me?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I don't think we need to start with a clean sheet of paper, nor can we. When you have 3,000 regulations, the right thing to do is to systematically assess whether they are working, what is working well, what is working less well, and make changes as required, either to the legislative framework or to the guidance that supports it, and we are making changes there, or to the culture of the organisations who are implementing it.
But you say that, and at the beginning you said you were driven to improve an outcome-based sort of situation, which I agree with. That's what you need.
Yep.
But I read, as you say, 3 pieces of legislation, increasing the complexity of the regulatory landscape. And then I read, your DEFRA is largely reacted to short-term or high-profile issues. I also read in your school report 3 out of 10 is the number of goals that you've achieved in the government's environmental improvement plan that have largely, that's again a subjective judgment by the look of it, improved in recent years, including cleaner air and reduced exposure to chemicals. 9 out of 43 are the number of government's environmental targets and commitments that are likely to be achieved, not have been achieved, likely to be achieved. So who's going to set these outcomes, and how are they going to be judged, and are people going to be penalised if they don't deliver against them?
Well, the strategic outcomes are set by the government, and they are set out.
Are they setting them correctly, do you think?
So the Environmental Improvement Plan was published in December. That sets out 10 goals, numerous commitments underneath, each one with a theory of change as to how to get there, a set of metrics to judge whether we're making progress. It's worth saying, as Marian said earlier, regulation is actually only one of the tools at the disposal of any government in terms of influencing behaviour change. A lot of what we are seeking to do, and maybe we'll come on to this with farming, is actually through payments, through the environmental land management schemes, etc. It might be supporting innovation grants, it might be through communications, it might be through advice, and actually some of the inspections that we run are advice-led inspections as well. So there are all sorts of ways in which we seek to shift the overall system towards the outcomes. But it's the government's job to set out those outcomes, accountable to Parliament. I think government has done that when it comes to the Environmental Improvement Plan. It is starting to do that much more in the water system, and there is a commitment in the Water White Paper to set out a strategic view, both over a 5-year period and a 25-year period. We have not yet done it as much as we want to on farming, and there is a commitment to a farming roadmap to come later this year. Again, that will set out the outcomes we want to see. And in all of these areas, the job then is to work out what is your theory of change? How are you going to get to those outcomes? How are you going to measure it? I say the EIP that we published in December, and Sally may want to say more about this, I think is actually a very good example of where DEFRA is starting to show how a set of inputs, including regulatory inputs, can feed through to the sort of outcomes we're describing.
I hear all that, but I've declared my interest as a farmer. I'm an active farmer, and I have to tell you, my experience of DEFRA is a very poor one, and most farmers would agree with me that DEFRA is not fit for purpose. Your rule book mutates like a virus. Half the time you shut your schemes within 24 hours because you've got it wrong and everybody's claiming legume fallow in this case. How can an industry that is based on long-term planning, how can they respond when you don't know your own rule book? And the other thing you've got a problem with, in my view, is you can't keep staff for more than a nanosecond. They all disappear, they go. So 1 minute you've got a contact you speak to, the next minute you've got a new temp who doesn't know the rules themselves. So I'm sorry, I really think that rather than giving us a lot of spiel, somebody needs to get their head down and have a plan to sort this out, because farming is a crucial industry to this country. And as a farmer, I can tell you, when I have adequate intelligence, I find it very hard to follow your homunculus-like rule book, which changes like the weather. So it's terrible.
Perhaps I could pick up a few of those points in turn, and just for your reassurance, we have got our head down and we are trying to sort this out, but I recognise some of the challenges that you are raising, and specifically on, I think you're referring to the closure of the
You're
SFI.
giving me lots of aspirational...
Order. We must let the permanent... You've had your question.
So on the very specific point about closing the funding window, I think that's a reference to the closure of SFI last year. You're quite right, there are lessons for us to learn. Ministers have been very clear that that was a breach of trust. We lost a lot of trust with farmers when that happened, and they've been equally clear they're going to take their time to make sure that we set up the SFI windows for this year, the first of which will open in June, in a way that gives much more clarity and certainty and transparency over the money, so that we are never in the situation where we have to close a window unexpectedly, and that's a fair criticism and one way we're changing our systems. On the overall complexity of regulations that farmers face, I think, again, that is true. It is something that Baroness Batters talks about in her review of farming profitability, and therefore it is one of the reasons why we have this process I was describing of continually reviewing and assessing where we can simplify regulations. Actually, the Department of Business and Trade is just starting a review particularly on farmers, around the clarity of guidance, the amount of data that is collected, and any regulatory barriers to farmers being able to take up new agri-tech. So that's a good example, I think, of a particular piece of regulatory review. The final point that you raised about the risk of regulations changing lots, I think, is a really important one too, and something you have to hold in the balance as a department alongside the appetite for getting on with the regulatory change. Just to take a sort of an example that crossed my desk last week, looking at the responses to a consultation we've recently been running on environmental industrial permitting, where there were various proposals for how we might improve and streamline that system. Some of the responses from business, understandably, were, yeah, that might make it better, but do you know what? We'd rather you just didn't change it, because there is a cost to us from changing it. So, like in the same way we have to hold lots of other things in balance, one of the things we have to hold in balance is the degree to which you provide stability and certainty for people who are regulated, and also the opportunity when they do arise to improve and simplify regulations.
Makes sense.
Rupert, yes, please, do carry on. Have you got another question?
I think I've got one more question on this for Philip. I mean, again, I find the Environment Agency, first of all, I think you all trip over each other. So I don't think DEFRA's giving you the leadership. I mean, it's not entirely your fault. You come in under their umbrella. But giving you a personal example. So I've had two problems on I have part of the River Colne flows through my farm. So we have, for a start, Thames Water, whose storm drains, when we get a storm, you get raw sewage flowing into the Colne. Nothing gets done about that. And again, I think the Environment Agency, you're too soft. In my view, you're as soft as a boiled maggot with them. You should deal with that.
Okay, you made a
equally,
point.
Geoffrey, the other issue was sulfuric. There was a fire in a chemical store on the banks of the river, and we had hydrochloric acid that the fire brigade couldn't therefore put the fire out. And this hydrochloric acid got into the river. Took you 5 years to deal with it.
Rupert, I think we...
So, Geoffrey, I think there's a lot that needs to be done.
No, I agree.
Loads of stuff.
Yeah, right. Come on. Which one? Philip, do you wish to answer that?
Okay, where would you like me to start? Hydrochloric acid, storm spills, IT,
water.
what would be best?
Start with Thames Water.
Okay, so...
Water quality.
Right, so let's just start with that. First of all, we have to follow the law as it is, not how we would like it to be. And I just want to remind the committee that in many cases, a sewage spill during a period of extremely high rain is lawful. I recognise that is not a popular position, but that is the law. And quite often, people say, why have you not prosecuted this company? And the answer is, a storm overflow that takes place during a wet day can be lawful. I just want to make that point. That may be the case in that area. And secondly, I want to make a point about criminal prosecutions, if I may, because we do them. We are a very strange regulator that we lack the civil prosecution powers that our colleagues in Ofwat happen. That's a key finding, actually, of the Cunliffe Review, that you need to actually level up the civil penalties. It's faster and cheaper. We are seeing cases now with water companies we are taking, and the court listing can be 3 years away before we get to court. So there is a genuine issue there about whether a criminal prosecution structure is going to be an effective deterrent against this offending in the water sector. And the answer to that, of course, is to bring in more civil penalties. They were proposed in the Water Special Measures Act. There is, in fact, a thing called a variable monetary penalty, which DEFRA will need to move the second legislation. We're waiting for that to happen later this year. And we may, under the Cunliffe proposal, see the new regulator, the super regulator, have the ability to levy more civil penalties on water companies that we cannot currently do in the Environment Agency. So there's clearly a justice and enforcement gap there. No one is denying that. But I think it's a bit harsh to attack my frontline staff who are doing their best to try and bring those cases to court. It's very, very challenging. All that said, we do prosecutions against water companies. We've done quite a few of them. I think 39 in the last 3 years, so not doing too badly. Hydrochloric acid, were you talking about the criminal prosecution of that case?
That took 5 years, yeah.
5 years right now is quite good going. I'm afraid to say.
In 2006.
Okay, well, I wasn't there in that period. And then on your other points, if I may just say a bit about systems and so on. So, in 2020, looking back a few years, the Environment Agency got to a situation where if you took out all its access spreadsheets, all of its data, it had 700 IT systems. And since then, we have made very, very good progress on turning around that legacy. We've closed down 350 of those systems and modernised them, moved them onto secure cloud with great help from our colleagues in DEFRA, Digital and Technology. We had a situation in which it was impossible for members of Parliament to find out what was happening in their constituency on water quality. There was no web explorer, the data wasn't available. You could only access the report through an FOI. Now, we publish all of our reports. There is a water explorer, go and have a look at it. All our data will be on there. Now we have to repeat that trick for waste and for the other sectors. I appreciate that, but we are making quite good progress. In 2023, we were set targets by DEFRA. I personally believe in targets. I think public bodies need targets. Only 23% of them were met. Last year, 63% were met. This year, we're aiming for 75%. Now, you may say these targets are misleading. They're not the right targets. Okay, open to that. That's a conversation to be had. But if you're running a large organisation, you need clarity from the sponsor department on the targets you have to meet, and then you have to do your darndest to meet them. And what it feels like right now in the A's, every month, I am saying to all of my area directors, are you meeting your targets? Maybe they're the right ones, the wrong ones, but people are trying to meet them. I think we are making some progress, Mr. Lowe, and our board, who take a very, very serious look at the performance, who exactly had the reaction you had reading those, have pushed the executive team in the EA to improve performance at every level. We may not be wholly there, but we are making progress.
Thank you.
The record, Mr. Duffy, you might like to clarify that whilst stormwater discharges may be legal, dry weather conditions discharges have to be according to the permit, and that's when you will take action.
It's a very good clarification, Mr. Duffy, and one that is right. All I would say at the minute is we are very keen on transparency, so we're publishing all of the storm overflows from the water industry. There are very many of them, but it is not the case that all of those are unlawful, and we have to look day by day and case by case to see whether there was heavy rain on that day or it was a dry day. The dry day spills are the ones that are unlawful, subject to a thing called the backneat test, without getting too much detail.
And my constituents relating to the River Colne and other rivers in my constituency would say some of those dry weather conditions are still too high. Are you reviewing the existing provisions?
Yes, so the situation there is that under a thing called the storm overflow reduction plan, the Environment Agency has issued guidance to say it plans to permit and put a spill target into permits. In fact, I wrote to water companies last week about that. Under DEFRA instruction, there will be a 10-year average number of spills and an annual average of spills to make sure we're seeing progress. Once the investment from the price review goes through and the work has been completed on that storm overflow, it will in turn be re-permitted. The permit will have annual limits in it, and we'll expect the companies to comply with that. So there is progress on that front.
Very helpful. Just one for you, Permanent Secretary. We've already heard this morning the extreme complexity in this area, 3,000 pieces of legislation. You were very proud that you put through 65 extra SIs, so you've added to the list of 3,000. Have you ever thought, George Bernard Shaw said genius is simplicity. Have you ever thought about withdrawing any of these pieces of legislation that clearly aren't working?
Well, I think it's a very fair challenge. I think some of the SIs we put through are about amending existing legislation, so they're not necessarily adding to the statute book, they're clarifying and simplifying in some cases. I think our opportunity to do larger resets of the sort you're talking about do come around every so often. I think water is a good example at the moment. So the commitment in the Water White Paper is to take a look at the underpinning legislation, see whether it can be stripped back. We have committed to moving away from the current set of plans to 2 planning systems for water, one around the environment and one around the supply of water. That is a simplification process. We are looking to take the 2 main underlying bits of environmental law, the Water Framework Directive and the Wastewater Directive, and bringing those together into a consolidated. That is an opportunity to simplify and streamline. So we do take those opportunities when they come along as well.
Thank you. Catherine, please. Catherine McKenna.
Thank you. I also wanted to touch on the complexity of the regulatory environment. And I think it's quite striking, the statement, it's in the National Audit Office report, but it's from DEFRA's independent review, that the regulatory system isn't working as well as it should to support either nature recovery or economic growth. So the fact that it's serving neither purpose to the extent that it needs to is a huge concern. We do have the Planning and Infrastructure Act, so it would be helpful to understand to what extent that is going to add further complexity to this landscape, or to what extent it should hopefully serve in the other direction. And I was looking particularly to you, Philip and Marian, and how it will affect your regulatory activities.
Would you mind if I just
Happy,
said something
yeah.
in the video, maybe bring Marian in, particularly on the Nature Restoration Fund, because I think the two are linked quite well. So one of the challenges, I think, which means we don't always get the right outcome for either the economy or nature, is that we get drawn right down to a very micro level geographically to site-specific solutions. And there are, some quite totemic cases where that is, has resulted in outcomes which you look at and you think, well, how is that serving either the economy or nature as well as it could do? In many respects, some of the reforms underpinned by the Planning and Infrastructure are there to solve that problem, and the Nature Restoration Fund in particular is the example I'd look at. And I'll bring Marian in, if I may, just to say a bit about that. But that is essentially saying to developers that in certain circumstances, rather than trying to work out an on-site solution to a particular challenge you have around nature, instead, have a more certain approach for you as a developer, pay into a thing called the Nature Restoration Fund. And in a sense, government will take the risk, the biodiversity risk, off you unto itself, and it has created a plan, an environmental plan in a particular area to tackle a particular challenge around nature, and you will pay into that, and then we will deliver that. It's faster from a development perspective. It's more ambitious from an environmental perspective because the pooling of money allows us to do things at a greater scale. So you get a better outcome for the economy and a better outcome for nature. But Marian probably explained that better than I have.
Do you mind if I just asked one thing specific on that? Is it targeted towards large developers, and is it equally accessible to smaller developers?
So I'll address that direct and then build on what Paul has said. I think it is probably as likely, if not more likely, to be used by small developers than large developers. And I'll explain that. So as Paul has said, the Act does not change the obligation on a developer. So if they wish to develop and their development will have an impact on a protected site and protected species, they currently have obligations to assess and mitigate and compensate for those. What the scheme does, it doesn't change that, it just makes it quicker and easier and more certain. It builds on schemes Natural England had run in the past, like district level licensing and alternative green space projects. So we've tested the principle, and we also use the principle anyway. What the Act does is make that more mainstream, more normalised. The reason I think small developers are more likely to use it, they are less likely to have the capacity that the big developers, the big house builders, tend to have their own in-house ecology. They also tend to own enough land to discharge their obligations themselves. We see that with biodiversity net gain as well. They are more likely to wish to develop it within their site. And there's lots of really good examples out there. I was down at a site in Kent last autumn with Barratt Redrow Housing, who have made wonderful community green space at the same time as meeting their obligations. So I think those developers may choose to carry on doing it as they do. It is the developers who are less likely to have capacity. I think the other important point to build on what Paul was saying, I think the other reason we're so supportive of the legislation, so keen to get on with it, It isn't just that it will help the developer. Many of the things that are now impact on our protected sites simply can't be dealt with by a single developer. So we're often looking at cumulative impacts of water. We're looking at water from the regulated water industry, from unregulated activities. So it's quite unreasonable to ask that developer alone to look after that. So they will now be able to pay into a fund that allows us to look at that more systemic approach. And to go back to your original question, we see examples of some developers who discharge their obligations well. We also, a lot of people say to us, a lot of the members of the public say to us, but developers just don't look after the work when it's done. They move on, they're no longer involved in that site. So having a scheme where a body like Natural England and the partners we will work with, including farmers and landowners, to actually manage and maintain on the ground, the sites on the ground, is likely to have a much bigger impact for nature and will become one of the things that contributes to those environmental improvement plan targets.
Philip, are there impacts from the Act on the Environment Agency's obligations?
There are when we do our own schemes, because we also have to comply with biodiversity net gain in our flood work. My comment really would just be that on development, we are trying to attack this problem from different angles. So we've had great cooperation from DEFRA actually on contaminated land guidance. It was a real bone of contention a year ago, where often it's not so much about nature, but we're often dealing with highly toxic materials, chromium-6, arsenic, radioactive material, in sites that need development but have to be carefully managed to protect the impact on human health as well as on the environment. That has been, I think, a really big step forward for the industry. And we're trying to cooperate with government at the strategic level to make sure that we think about issues like water supply and sewerage at the start of the plan rather than at the end of the plan. We are very involved with the New Towns Task Force, with Oxford Cambridge ARC, with many of these large schemes to try and help unlock that development early on and deliver really good outcomes for nature as well.
And could I just sort of put a challenge in there? When it comes to smaller developers, I appreciate they may not have the capacity to deliver on what may be the environmental requirements of undertaking a development. But I think there's a balance to strike between pricing small developers out of the market. And do you think the balance has been struck correctly in that regard, or it will end up just forcing only larger developments to want to take on these responsibilities?
So there will be a very fine judgment between setting the levy at a rate which will allow us to address the environmental impact but not affecting viability. Ultimately, that will be a decision for the Secretary of State, of course, and that Natural England will make the recommendation about the price at which we operate, but ultimately that will be one of the tests that the Act requires the Secretary of State to test.
Okay, and then the other question I was going to ask, and you could answer both at the same time, is do you think that has brought sufficient streamlining of the interaction with regulators for developers? Because we know the government is very ambitious about seeing more housing development in particular. Is that sufficient to streamline it, or do we need to do more further still?
I'll just come in first on the levy regs and then on that second question. So on is it affordable for small developers? So we're very conscious of, as we develop, and we haven't yet published the first environmental delivery plans because we have to take through a set of regulations first, but we're very conscious of making sure that that both delivers to the environment and produces a real alternative by being affordable for developers. In terms of small developers, one of the things that takes away is the need for the upfront surveys and for the whole of that cost to be borne by one developer. So as Marian said, that levy will be both predictable because they'll be able to see at the outset what that cost would be, and because the cost of doing the initial survey work has been shared across the plan, there is the potential for actually to be a disproportionate benefit to the smaller developer who might only want to build 10 homes and can just pay the levy for those 10 homes and not have to meet the full costs of survey work that might be needed across a whole catchment. So we will have to get the first ones out in the open in the next few months, and then you'll be able to judge. But we're optimistic about the ability of that to help small developers in particular, and we think that's where the EDP process has the most potential, actually. In terms of Marian may want to come back on further join up, but I think that we think that this is kind of one part of what we're doing to simplify, but as you've heard, we do operate in complex systems, and depending on where developers are working, they are likely to have to engage with more than one developer from within, more than one regulator from within the DEFRA system. That may be the Environment Agency in Natural England, it may be the Environment Agency in the Marine Management Organisation. So we are putting in a number of reforms kind of top to bottom through our systems to make those work more simply. For a small developer, that might just be about the reforms that we're doing to make sure they can provide information once and field officers from 2 regulators can both see the same information. It might be quite simple things like that. For a very large infrastructure project, working up at the very other end of the spectrum, that's going to be, do we need a lead environmental regulator to actually guide that developer through the whole of our system, where there might be 3 or 4 regulators involved, and they might be doing that over a number of years. But we're trying to look at our systems top to bottom to make that journey as smooth as possible.
Perhaps if I could just comment on one other part of the other important clause in the Planning and Infrastructure Act. It's part of a suite of reforms, some legislative, some non-legislative, of course, as you'll know. I think one other significant reform that will really drive forward some of Natural England's reform ambitions is the change we have under previous legislation. We were obliged by law to comment on every planning application that's sent to us. We now have discretion, and we think that will really help us focus our efforts on where where our impact is really needed than the tick box exercise that could tend to feel like. So that's another example of operating where we make the biggest difference, and we're backing that up with data systems that allow a developer or a planner to look at the same information as Natural England staff would have looked at, and therefore make a much more informed judgment on whether they need our help or whether they can confidently proceed without us.
That's really helpful, because that's one of the big frustrations you hear from small developers, is it just feels like a tick box exercise with no tangible or discernible output at the end. So that's reassuring to hear.
Could I just clarify 1 or 2 points, because these nature recovery schemes are causing both environmentalists on the one hand and then developers on the other hand some consternation. Is this going to be a levy on all developments?
So the Nature Restoration Fund is an optional scheme that developers can opt into if they want to use that as one way of discharging an obligation that they already have. So it doesn't create a new obligation. If a developer already has an obligation, for example, to deal with the nutrient impact of their development, they could still choose to do it their own way. They might have a provider they already work with, they might want to do something on site. If they don't want to do that, they can opt into this scheme and pay the levy and discharge the obligation. So it's about sites where there's particular pressures, so it probably doesn't need to operate across the whole of the country, but if you're in a catchment that's already overloaded with nutrients, then those are the places that will take the scheme first.
Will they know when they make the application what the rate of the levy is?
Yes.
And finally, Permanent Secretary, you said we will carry out the scheme. When you say we, who is we?
It's being led by Natural England.
Right. And how will you carry it out, Marian?
How is prescribed in the law. That's perhaps not quite you're getting at, but we are already we're already working on the first round of EDPs, and the how is we are looking at the likely development impact of the site, the known environmental pressures, and we use that information to set out the environmental delivery plan, which says if development happens here, this is the nature and the scale of mitigation needed. So that might be creation of new habitat for displaced species, it might be creation of nutrient systems such as we're currently doing, it might be creation of alternative green spaces where there is a need for more recreational space. So the how is fairly well described. Once that plan is up and running, it's approved by the Secretary of State, and that then makes very clear to the developer their options, and they will use that to choose. The other part of the how is once the plans are in place, Natural England has the obligation to then use the funds that developers pay to deliver against those plans. So as developers' funds come in, we will start to invest that in action on the ground.
We all know about the back tunnel on HS2. How do we know that this scheme is going to be proportionate and value for money for the developers?
This scheme, I'll come to the back tunnel in a moment because that's an ever so slightly different question. One of the ways this scheme will be proportionate and value for money is there are a number of amendments that came into the bill as it went through Parliament. You mentioned a moment ago that some of the environmental bodies had concerns about the schemes. They were addressed to a large extent by amendments that give certainty there'll be overall improvement, there'll be certainty of pace, that the scale of the pace of the environmental restoration will keep step with pace of development. So that will give certainty on the environmental side. I'll turn to the back tunnel and I might invite...
Just before we do the thing I just wanted to bring us back to is the purpose of NRF, and actually, and back to sort of one of the NAO's finding, one of the regular findings about this being a sort of risk-averse system that we oversee with insufficient innovation. It's worth pausing. And NRF is not that. NRF is an innovation. It is a world-leading innovation. We're in the foothills of it, where we will do everything we can to get this right. But this is trying to find a bit of the system where we are aspiring to a higher level of outcomes, both economic outcomes and environmental outcomes at scale. So, we are holding a higher risk appetite here. There's lots of work to do, but I just want us to make sure we are recognising that we are. This is a good example of we are trying to move the system in a different way, which tackles that lack of outcomes on both the economic and the environmental side. The Bat Tunnel is your really good example of where perhaps that didn't work out quite so well in the past.
Right, let's have a bit of an explanation on the Bat Tunnel, very briefly, because time is moving on.
So one point of principle that this legislation now gives us more confidence to use. So the legislation embeds the principle of using a strategic solution, so not just looking at what's happening immediately on the site, but looking at the overall impact and opportunities. The other significant change the legislation makes is it, again, reinforces in a principle we've been working on, that we shouldn't perhaps follow the mitigation hierarchy quite as strictly as case law has suggested we should. So at the moment, the law says you must first avoid an impact, then you must do mitigation, i.e. try and avoid that impact, and only then can you do compensation. And I think schemes like the Bat Tunnel, that is an example. There are many others when that quite rigid approach led us to do something that was not wrong in law or wrong in its effectiveness, but might not have had the optimal outcomes that Paul was describing. So we have a scheme there that will protect that colony of bats, but it will not add a lot of value to any of the other bats in the area.
One of the important shifts here is to engage much earlier in the process. And just to give an example of one of the areas we are changing, we've seen over the last year or so, it's a Corrie recommendation from Dan Corrie's report, which is to set up an infrastructure task force within DEFRA, where we have a list of the most important, if you like, 50 infrastructure projects where we think environmental regulations may have a role to play as it's going through. And rather than, this is a horrible caricature of the system, but sometimes the system can feel like it's just, you ask a question and the regulators give you a yes or no answer. And if the answer's no, go away, try something else, come back and we'll give you another yes or no answer. This is about shifting to a position where DEFRA Group, the regulators, and DEFRA as the core department as well, is sitting in a room together with other government departments. In the case of the Water Delivery Task Force, actually, which runs a similar role on water, sometimes getting in the private companies themselves saying, what would it take for the answer to be yes? What can we do which is innovative and creative and solves the problem and allows development to be unblocked and deliver better outcomes for nature? That's quite, that might sound basic in a way, but that's quite a cultural shift within the organisation. Sally chairs the Infrastructure Task Force, and on a regular basis they are unblocking problems. So in a sense, your future bat mitigation structures, hopefully you won't hear about them because they've been, we've got involved much earlier. The NRF gives us an additional tool as well. So, the success will be relative silence as we're able to deliver both the development and indeed the bigger outcomes for nature too.
Thank you very much. I could ask more questions on that, but we have to move on. Blake.
Thank you, Chair.
Stevenson,
thank you, Chair. I found the NAO report very troubling, and I just want to explain why. I spent 15 years in financial services before I came into Parliament, and I think had a financial services firm received this report from their auditor, that financial services firm would need to report that to the FCA, and that firm would be dragged over the coals and more likely than not would be fined. So my opening question is to ask each of you, DEFRA and the regulators, are you at risk of holding those that you regulate to higher standards than you yourself can achieve given the deficiencies throughout this report? Maybe we'll start with DEFRA.
Well, we do hold ourselves to very high standards. We don't always achieve those very high standards, and I think what the NAO report is telling us is there's more to do. I don't think we should shy away from that. Nor, though, do I think we are a completely broken system. As I mentioned earlier, when I look at the NAO report from covering very similar territory from a couple of years ago, I can see that we've moved on substantially from where we were then. We're never going to be complacent. We're always going to need to do more. I think the NAO report we have in front of us is fair and reasonable and challenging, and that is right. As I say, we hold ourselves to high standards. But, as a relative newcomer coming into DEFRA and able to, with a fresh pair of eyes, yes, I can see lots of areas we need to do better, and, we've been setting some of those out. I also see across the group, 30,000 hard-working, dedicated, talented staff who are doing some brilliant work, both centrally and across the country.
Thank you. Environment Agency, Philip?
So we're an unusual organisation. We're a regulator, but we also maintain more than 500,000 flood assets around the country. And so when I talk to a chief executive of a water company or a waste company, I do understand the pressures they're under in terms of whole life cycle management of their assets, what it's like in the supply chain, the challenges they face. And we're very careful not to, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and we listen hard to our partners, and we understand what those businesses feel about our regulation, and we try and build that good relationship with them at all times. And at the same point, we're also mindful of our own environmental impact as an organisation. We're about to publish a revised strategy for reducing our environmental impact. This is things like using low carbon concrete, moving away from steel rebar, trying to cut our emissions if we can, and also make sure we fully comply with our obligations to support nature, particularly in the water environment. A big issue for us right now is eel management and some of the fishery issues that we face because we work in watercourses quite a lot. So I think everyone in the EA is very nervous about the risks that you point out, and we are mindful of it as we do our work, and hopefully we do not hold people to higher standards than we hold ourselves.
Thank you. Natural England, Marian?
So the high standard I hold myself and Natural England to account for is, are we doing everything we can to maximise nature recovery? So that's my benchmark, and as I said earlier, the reason we believe that matters so much is because of what society needs from nature, which continues to change and evolve as we see the impact of climate change, different public expectations and so on. So I think there is some frustration within, you might hear it in my voice, from the question that we were asked earlier. Sometimes the regulatory framework, the system in which we operate, doesn't maximise the impacts for our nature, and neither does it help with economic development and help our customers. So that's where my frustration comes in. That's why I hold myself to account. And I think there's two ways we're looking to tackle that. One is the focus of this report. Are we doing enough to think about our role as a regulator within a wider system? Are we working with our colleagues in local government, our colleagues in other regulators? I think there's also a theme you've heard from Paul several times, which I would echo very hard. Are we thinking about the outcome, not the process? And do our staff feel empowered to feel more as partners to those we develop, more collaborators? And it doesn't always feel like that. It doesn't feel like that for my staff, and I know it doesn't always feel like that for my customers. So that's a big focus for our change. I think the other theme I will touch on again is we are also using a number of other tools. Regulation is not Natural England's first lever. Even in the regulatory spectrum, I rely on the one that the NAO have also set out. We tend to be much more involved in the advice and support rather than the hard enforcement and legal action role. But even then, a lot of the outcomes we want to achieve requires us to also use advice and engagement, partnering with businesses and financial incentives to sort of focus on those big nature goals.
I think we're agreed that significant improvement is required. Paul, could you walk us through, please, your view on what a good strategic approach to regulation ought to be? You're new into the role, you've been looking at this with a fresh pair of eyes. Where do you want to get to and when?
So I think I would point to sort of three areas of work which I think are key to good regulation. So the first is around strategic outcomes. Again, this comes through from all the reports, we've talked about it. Is DEFRA and the DEFRA system sufficiently clear what success looks like in all of the areas of our work? And I would say we are in some, particularly if you look at the December publication of the Environmental Improvement Plan, very, very clear on what we're trying to achieve in certain areas. I think we haven't yet set out with as much clarity as we need to in some of the other areas. The farming roadmap later this year, for example, will hopefully provide clarity on those areas. I think there's then this question of, and Marian's alluded to this, are we asking regulators to operate within a suboptimal legislative framework, in essence? And as I mentioned earlier, we have a rolling programme of evaluating through post-implementation reviews and other reviews which bits of our regulatory framework are working and which are not or need revising. We then have primary legislation changes, secondary legislation changes and guidance changes, which are an important part. Maybe we come on to guidance changes, but it's a key recommendation from Darren Corrie's work is the importance of identifying the most used guidance and revising those. We've identified the top 10 most used pieces of guidance. We've already revised 5 of those. We should be out consulting on revised habitats regulation assessment guidance later this spring. And then the third area is around the culture of the regulators themselves. That gets you into how clear we are as a Department of State in our expectations on DEFRA regulators. We are hoping very shortly to issue both the Environment Agency and Natural England with a strategic policy statement. That's a new document, non-statutory, but setting out really clearly this is what we expect you to do, and indeed this is how we expect you to do it, including the concept of constrained discretion, which comes through from Dan Corrie's review and John Cunliffe's review. So that sort of sets out new approaches on risk and risk management. We do need to undertake more innovative regulatory approaches. So we've just had a good conversation about the Nature Restoration Fund. I mean, biodiversity net gain was actually a really interesting international innovation. So we need to make sure that we are driving those kind of innovations through the system. We've got a particular programme of work around planning and infrastructure changes, which is where very often this challenge around economic growth and environmental regulations plays out. There's more we need to do on joint working. We touched very briefly on the lead environmental regulator. That's appropriate for large projects. It's not necessarily going to be appropriate for all the projects, but we need to find areas where our regulatory system is joining up much more. Mr. Lowe pointed out earlier that the number of different regulators that you will come into contact with as a farmer, we need those regulators joining up in a more singular way. And then we also need the front-end service, the customer-facing services, to be as slick and smart and digitally enabled as we possibly can. Again, I think we've made some progress on that, but there's much more to do. So it's a very broad range of things, but I tend to think about it in those 3 areas. Be clear on your outcomes, set up your legislation and regulatory framework in the right way, and drive the right culture through your regulators.
My final question, if I may, Chair. There's an awful lot going on, and what you've described is quite ambitious, given where you are at the moment. How are we going to hold you to account? At what point are you going to be happy that you've delivered those things? But I think more crucially, how are you going to sort of get off the starting line? So you're in this reactive mode. How are you going to get out of the reactive gear into the strategic gear, given everything that's going on, in order for you to even just get going with all of those ambitions?
So on your question about when am I going to be happy, I know clearly the answer to that. Never. It is my job to never be happy and constantly listening to customers, to developers, to constantly be pressing for further change. When are we going to get out the starting blocks? We got out the starting blocks many months ago. So, I mean, as I say, we've come a long way over the last couple of years. I'm not coming into this new job thinking this is year zero, it all starts now. There's a huge amount that has gone on. The work that I was describing, setting out some of the new strategic intent around the Water White Paper or the EIP, this is months and months of work that is coming to fruition now. So we are shifting into exactly that more strategic approach. There are definitely things we need to tick off. I mean, I think we started with 149 recommendations, and we need to be constantly going through how many of those have we actually moved through. We've already moved through quite a lot of them. But I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we're in the starting blocks. I think we were out of the starting blocks a while ago, but equally I don't want to give you the impression that we're ever going to come here into this committee and say the job's done, nothing to see here, there's no way we can get better, and I'd be amazed if the NAO ever wrote a report that allowed us to say that with credibility.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
For us to keep calling you back for Permanent Secretary to see how you're getting on. Tris.
So my questions are going to link to the regulatory environment and whether you're giving them sufficient flexibility. So I suppose my overarching question is around the sort of federalism versus centralisation structure. The UK operates quite a centralised structure versus if you compare it with other countries around the world, the US specifically. We have a precautionary approach, which effectively unless it's something which proactively we pursue, the answer is no. Whereas in the US, they produce a cost-benefit approach where unless the cost is demonstrable and the benefit is there, they will have a different regulatory sort of standard. Within the Corrie review is something called constrained discretion. Can I just get your understanding? Are we moving? What is your understanding? Are we moving away from a precautionary approach towards a more cost-benefit approach? And should that be, because there's a real balance, there's an issue here with. I understand you want to give more powers to the regulators. I understand you want to have more powers to developers and others. But then there's an inherent conservatism here, where you want to retain the controls, the levers centrally, and in a sense prohibit that change by effectively having a principle which is by definition not allowing for change. So can I just get, where do we want to be? What is the perfect outcome here in 5 to 10 years' time with this approach?
Let me say a few words about constrained discretion and what that means, and then perhaps invite Phil and Marian to say something about how they're introducing that within their organisations. And I should say that the strategic policy statements that I mentioned earlier that we hope to issue shortly to the two regulators, constrained discretion is very much at the heart of those. It will also be at the heart of the new single water regulator. It was one of John Cunliffe's recommendations that we put there. So what does it mean, constrained discretion? I think it means two things and their intention, and to some degree it plays to the tension you're describing. So the constrained bit is really a plea that there is a degree of consistency in the way in which we apply regulations around the country, that local officers within regulatory settings have a clear playbook, a clear guardrails as to what they are expected to do. That is really important if you're a regulated entity, if you're a business, because you need to know what to expect as a point of consistency wherever you are in the country from a particular regulator. It's one of the reasons why Phil will be publishing, this is how we do farm inspections, for example, so there is clear transparent expectations. And that's one of the things we hear. So particularly when we talk with large developers who might be interacting with the regulators in different parts of the country, they will say, what we really, really want is just more consistency, please. And then one of the other bits of feedback we get from developers and others is, well, we don't want local officers in these regulators to be completely fettered by centralised guidance. We want them to be able to exercise discretion and make common sense judgments that fit the local area. And of course, we do too. And that's the discretion bit. So you've got the constrained bit, which is more of a sort of centralising approach, to use your analogy, and the discretion bit, which says actually we want people who know their local area and can work with local businesses and others to reach common sense solutions which are outcome focused. Now, that is a long way of describing what is just then a very complicated thing to embed across regulators. If you've got a regulator like Phil's regulator, which is about 13,000 people, working right across the country, where are the areas where you want them to be entirely consistent and follow very prescriptive central guidelines? That's one of the reasons why revising guidance is really important. And where are the areas you want them to feel empowered to reach different outcomes? Just on the very specific point about precaution, the precautionary principle, that is fundamental. That is not changing. The question is the precautionary principle at times being overly interpreted? So that question comes up in the habitats regulations in particular. One of the questions we're looking at in terms of revising the HRA guidance, which I mentioned earlier, is it being over-interpreted? But that's not to say the principle is the wrong principle. It remains a core legal principle for us, but it is about how that is interpreted in practice. But maybe Phil and Marian could talk about how they're applying this.
Me to go first. Yes, I think you are quite right. Some of the legislation, if looked at through the lens, can feel restrictive. It can feel narrow. You've talked about the precautionary principle. We also have a principle of proving no adverse impact. Even saying that double negative confuses me, frankly. So I think you are right to point to the fact that legislation can be a constraint. But I think what we've been doing over the last few years is looking at how we interpret and apply that legislation. So in the precautionary principle, for example, it's not necessarily precautionary about every single site or every single individual animal or plant. It's looking at precaution against the population, against the ecosystem, and I think that's the guidance we're starting to develop at the moment will help set that right. So the legislation doesn't always feel helpful, but there are many ways in which we can use that. So I think we're particularly looking forward to, as Paul has already said, having that clear constrained discretion statement, being able to revise the guidance our staff work to, but also revise the guidance we give to the outside world, because that risk appetite, it isn't just the regulators that need to understand where their discretion is. Other decision makers like planners, businesses themselves, those who advise businesses, such as the ecological profession, I think we all need to have that shared understanding of the framework in which we're working. And I think that's how we are increasingly trying to think about it, less of a rule book, more as a framework in which people can innovate. And I suppose that would be my second comment. I sometimes feel slightly uncomfortable when people say you need to raise your risk appetite, because that implies we don't care anymore and we'll take risks with things. I think what we're saying is we want to be able to be more innovative and flexible in achieving the right outcome while staying within that framework. So we've been doing quite a lot of thinking about this within Natural England, starting with our board. We spent a lot of time with our board over the last year as we led into our new strategy to clearly define our risk appetite. We're working that through all of our major programmes. For some, we are more cautious. We're perhaps more cautious with money in some programmes. We're more cautious with the law in some, but in others, we can be much more creative. And I think when we've worked that through, we will also be able to make that a public. I'm expecting my board next month to review a public-facing risk statement, which can also give other people confidence that we're trying to get that balance right. Actually, the final thing I will just say is exactly the point, as you will all know this, the hardest bit of an organisation change is its culture. I've got 2,500 people, and I'm asking them to re-look at how they think about decisions they've perhaps been making. Many of them have been in this profession for 20, 30, 40 years, including myself, actually. So this is quite a big change for us, and that's why we need to use these various mechanisms. We need to be communicating, sharing good practice, using the guidance that DEFRA give us, and also making sure we're sharing that with our customers and stakeholders as well as our staff.
I'm just cautious of times because I've got some follow-up questions. If I can ask you to keep our answers a bit more short, otherwise no one else is getting an opportunity. You referenced the water industry. We had you referenced the water reforms. We had Ofwat in a few weeks ago, and I specifically asked them about the SPSs. There are 59 of those. They indicated that they're reducing them down to 2 clear sort of frameworks. And I understand in the last 7 days you've added another 7 objectives. So my point being is that there's constant disconnect between you saying you want to give powers on a discretionary basis, but yet you're constantly saying here's more and more SPSs, more and more requirements. There is a disconnect there, and I think that's what that's what's being heard. I suppose my next question is just linked to, if I could just have, just very quickly, you mentioned 4 programme teams that were delivering the Corrie review. I'd be quite interested to know what the headcount in those teams are, how they're structured, and if you could provide us with an organogram, I think that would be really helpful to do that. And just so if that's okay, and then just my last is just around the infrastructure board. Obviously, this is something that's very new. As I understand it, the infrastructure board doesn't publish anywhere. I'm struggling to find any minutes from conversations. You're dealing with very big projects. But again, as I understand it, there's been some concerns around, as an example, a hospital in Cambridge was not given permission.
Chris, we should allow our witnesses, these very big questions with lots of questions, they get lost in the time. Should we just try and get the witnesses to answer what you have asked?
Yes. So the question is are we going to move to a position where the infrastructure board is more transparent so that people can see some of the thoughts behind the decision processes? Yeah,
thanks very much. So I chair the DEFRA Infrastructure Board, the aim of which is to look at the largest projects which hit kind of 2 criteria of being nationally significant and also having significant environmental challenges, to get together the regulators and the government departments that sponsor those projects to give us early sight so that we can try to do that early identification and escalation of problems. It is not a public forum. We're often dealing with projects which are commercially sensitive and where there are live regulatory decisions. So I think we're really happy to think about how we can talk about what progress that board is making, but it is probably never going to be something that is played out in public when those are regulatory decisions that haven't yet been taken or often commercially sensitive projects. But what we are already seeing is that by looking at those projects, we are already seeing opportunities for regulators to get together with the developers or with others to find early solutions. And we're also starting to identify, for example, clusters of projects happening in the same places, which we didn't have visibility of before. And we can take really simple steps, like that means that we can say, well, actually, Natural England's East of England office is going to need to strengthen a team over here because we can see the pipeline coming. And actually, those 30 developers of solar projects in that region are all facing similar challenges. We can get out on the front foot and offer them a solution up front. So that's the sort of thing that we're doing with that board, but it's not a public forum.
I'm going to call Anna next, but just a warning for everybody. After Anna has finished all her questions, we will take a 5-minute break to give everybody a chance to stretch their legs or whatever. So, Anna Dixon, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, in the NAO report, paragraph 14, it says an overly risk-averse culture in DEFRA and the regulators has restricted some efforts to innovate and embrace new approaches. You talked earlier about a precautionary approach. One could also call that a risk-averse approach. It's just outside my constituency, but it affects the River Wharfe, which flows through my constituency. There was a proposed £43 million upgrade of the Ilkley sewage treatment works. A nature-based solution was proposed. I understand both Ofwat and Yorkshire Water were positive, but it was delayed by the Environment Agency, blocking a nature-based solution, a very good innovation, because there wasn't enough evidence to guarantee the quality of water post-treatment. So is this an example of where a risk-averse approach in the regulator is blocking innovation and, in particular, nature-based solutions? Mr. Duffy?
No, it is not, Ms Dixon. Let me answer that question directly. So nature-based solutions are very popular with the water industry because they're much cheaper than building engineered solutions for things like phosphorus stripping. They have lower energy consumption. They're popular too with many other community groups and those working in nature because they bring so many co-benefits, reduction in flood risk, for example, or better water ecology. But we in the Environment Agency must take a hard-headed approach to the removal of phosphorus from the natural environment. We must think like ecologists. And phosphorus, as you all know, the phosphorus cycle is bioaccumulative and very persistent. And in the case of the Wharfe, we are very concerned, under the Water Framework Directive, about high phosphorus levels permanently damaging the ecosystem in a way that is quite different to nitrates or biochemically activated oxygen demand. And so for that reason, and it's a debate that's been playing out in many locations in the context of the price review, it's a very science-based approach. You don't have to take my word for it. We will look at the publication of the evidence. We have concerns about the capacity of things like reed beds and nature-based solutions to absorb sufficient levels of phosphorus to comply with the law. And one of our jobs as a regulator, it's a difficult message to give in a forum like this, is that if this solution from the water company does not reduce sufficient phosphorus, we will not permit it. And we've had that debate in many water companies, as a big issue on the Tees as well, and also in Wessex, and we stand by our decision. Now, our decisions must be open and transparent and challengeable, and we must look at the evidence all the time. And if we do see evidence of a different, alternatively engineered, nature-based solution that can reduce sufficient phosphorus to bring the Wharfe into a really good condition for its water ecology, we will obviously accept that. We don't want to put people to very high-cost solutions. But right now, and right the way through our strategy for the price review, the removal of phosphorus, which generally requires an engineered solution, was uppermost in our mind, and that's completely appropriate in line with the legal obligations we have.
How are you going to gather the evidence if you don't implement and monitor such solutions? And obviously on this stretch of bathing water, in correspondence that I've seen, actually you've not been able to deploy enough inspectors to keep monitoring the downstream flows. So I'm keen to know, how are you going to gather sufficient evidence that would give you confidence to be able to permit these in the future, and also balance, I guess, the environmental compliance with these wider benefits that you quite rightly acknowledge?
I don't think we have to choose, by the way, the wider benefits and phosphorus reduction. I think if that was the choice, it's a pretty dismal choice for the natural environment. Because the very high phosphorus levels are so toxic to the water biota, they fundamentally change the nature of the ecosystem. So we know, as thinking like ecologists, that getting phosphorus levels down is incredibly important. That does not mean we are unsupportive of nature-based solutions elsewhere. In fact, we have done a lot of trials of nature-based solutions, particularly in things like treating very, very diluted groundwater overflow. And we've shown that in areas like nitrates, they work pretty well. So we're not anti-nature-based solutions, but we are not supportive of them where they don't reduce phosphorus. Now, on your question about monitoring, it's a good question, and we have at times struggled to get enough monitoring tests to meet our Water Framework Directive monitoring requirements. However, we are helped in this endeavour by the fact that DEFRA have insisted on upstream and downstream monitoring of key pollutants through sondes. So we have got a sense, as we go down the watercourse, of where those phosphorus levels might be coming from, and they are coming from I'm afraid to say, wastewater treatment works. So that is why we take the approach we're doing. We are running some trials. I don't think we're running one on the wharf. We have got some trials that are currently live, looking at whether this technology works. If the water industry have got other evidence, we are going to look at it, because we're obviously open to evidence. But so far, when we've looked at trials, we haven't been persuaded that the phosphorus reduction is good enough to meet the legal obligation.
This is obviously an example of where there may be dispute between different risk appetites of your regulators, of different regulators who may have a view, and some of your customers, in this case, the water companies. How are you, as a department, actually exploring and setting a risk appetite that allows for managed innovation within obviously clear parameters?
Yeah, so one thing we can't do is set a risk appetite, a singular risk appetite. I think that'd be the wrong thing to do, and I don't think that's exactly. So when you think about how many multiple regulatory schemes we have, so you want systems which flex your risk appetite and your approach to regulation depending on the activity we are talking about. So to use Phil's example, you're going to have a different risk appetite around solutions which involve nitrogen than you do around phosphorus for the reasons just described. You're going to have different risk appetite depending on geography. If you're by an important water course or you're not by an important water course, you're going to have different approaches. You're going to actually set different risk appetites around previously revealed behaviour of regulated entity. So you want to tread very lightly on people who are doing the right thing and doing everything they can to abide by sensible regulation, and you want to tread very heavily on those people who are deliberately not. And actually, we have a sort of hierarchy across the regulators, which moves from gentle advice through to much heavier-handed approaches to regulation. So across geography, across activity, across different regimes, across different individuals or businesses, you're going to have different risk appetites. So it's a constantly dynamic process. So you can't, as DEFRA as a department, simply say, here are not just one risk appetite, but indeed here are the set risk appetites. I think critical to it, and Phil alluded to this, is just transparency. So this is how we are making our decisions. This is the basis on which we are doing it. If you are a regulated entity yourself, that is really, really important so you know what to expect. Constant feedback loops as well. What are we understanding about, So we have learned a lot, or the EA has learned a lot, by going out and doing a much higher number of advice-led farm inspections. We've learned a lot about where the risks are and where they're not. And that's right, and then we can feed that back in. There's a constant conversation for us to have between the core department and regulators. In the end, what we would want to get to, in an ideal world, what you're doing is you're setting the outcomes that you want the regulators to deliver, and you're allowing them, to a large degree, to work out the relative risk appetites in order to deliver those outcomes with the resources they have. It's challenging because drawing a straight line from regulated activity to environmental outcomes is incredibly difficult, which is why we do tend to get more heavily involved and indeed do instruct the Environment Agency, as it were, to do a certain number of inspections, etc., in particular areas.
I'm conscious of time, and I have a couple more points on this issue of risk aversion and culture. Yep. I think from a regulated entity, they're keen on consistency. So I'm hoping what I heard in your answer there, Permanent Secretary, was that you are moving to a more consistent approach to risk appetite for a regulated entity, recognising there are differences by the points you described, but that for a regulated entity, they would experience consistency between the different regulators that they are a customer of. Judicial review. The culture, I think, as Corrie pointed to, some of this risk aversion comes from judicial review. Is it too easy at the moment for judicial review against decisions that you and your regulators are making?
I should ask Marian or Phil to respond to that, because they're in the day-to-day of making decisions. It is definitely the case that rightly we are alive throughout our work to legislative risk of one form or another, or litigation risk rather. That is true. And actually, it's one thing worth bearing in mind is that when we talk about risk aversion, what are we talking about? So some people would say that as a system we are overly risk averse because we're not intervening hard enough to deliver environmental outcomes because we fear litigation risk. In other areas, we get accused of leaning too hard into the environmental objectives that we have, and we get in the way of developers, and that's risk in another direction. So actually what risk aversion means and how risk plays out is very different in different parts. You're right that, the risk of legal action is one of the risks that we have to bear in mind. Quite often when people talk about risk aversion, that is what they mean. But I don't think it would be right to characterise the activity of either EA or NA as being driven by systematically driven by an overly cautious approach on litigation.
You want to briefly just respond if there is a problem with fear of JR, and if not, what are you sort of doing in terms of your sort of risk-averse culture?
I don't think we have a fear of JR. We go through a number each year, proportionate to the amount of regulation we do. We don't often lose. I don't think we should fear that we would lose. The point of that legal process is to help us understand how we should now be interpreting the law and to test whether we are getting that risk aversion right. So we don't fear them. I think the one thing we do fear is the cost of engaging in them, of course. They can be complex, lengthy processes. So we wouldn't do something likely that might trigger a JR, but we're not afraid of learning from the results, whether we win or lose.
Do you want to add anything, Mr. Duffy?
I think you've got to have a culture which always asks, but cares about the community and their environment, and asks, is this the right decision for the community and the environment? There will be legal risks, there will be financial risks, there will be reputational risks around that, but what is the right decision? And I think you can see evidence of us making that shift in things like the Waters Crowe decision.
And this risk-averse culture, I mean, obviously at the end of the day, the leadership on this comes from DEFRA, at all levels, and including your own civil servants within the department. So how are you making sure that they are open to change and innovation? I don't know who would like to take that.
Well, I can kick off, but why don't I ask Sally, because she knows the organisation better than I do. But by coincidence, the very first meeting I had on my very first day in this job was a conversation about risk aversion with our Audit and Risk Committee, and it was the start of a piece of work where we have been trying to develop our own tools around risk appetite so that we are making many more deliberate decisions. So every organisation has a risk appetite. It's a revealed, implicit risk appetite in the decisions they make. We're probably not spending enough time thinking about the implicit risk appetite in the status quo. So we will say we're low risk appetite. I don't think we are low risk appetite, because actually if you look at some of the outcomes that we were talking about earlier, we seem to be holding quite a lot of risk on those by dialing down risk elsewhere. So there's something very important to me that in every decision we are taking, and in every advice we are putting to ministers, when we think about risk, we are thinking about where we are deliberately pushing down risk and where we're deliberately pushing up risk as well. That is a very live conversation in the organisation at the moment. I don't know whether Sally wants to add in her own area.
Yeah, I would just say within my teams, the main thing that we are doing is connecting people with the real projects, places and people that are on the receiving end of our regulation. So it is quite easy to get into perhaps risk-averse or approach when you're being very theoretical and abstract and just looking at the law. And two things that we're doing, we talked about what we're doing with the infrastructure board. That is bringing real projects into our building and having us see the world as other people see us. And in my experience, that is the best way that our teams are getting to engage with what is the real world impact of the decisions that we are making, and being able to see ourselves through other people's eyes helps us to balance up, as Paul said, the different types of risk and get us away from just perhaps looking at legal risk to looking at risk for outcomes, risk for businesses, risk for growth.
Okay, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anna, very much. We'll now take a short break and return in, the clock is 17:06. If we could return sharply, if not before, 5:15 would be really helpful, 17:15. Order. Great. Sarah, I think you were going to start us, please.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Chair. So we've obviously been talking a lot about the regulation and how extensive it is. And the report, the National Audit Office report, points very clearly to how this can be a real problem for businesses and farmers. And obviously we've heard that evidence. I wonder, Mr. Duffy, if I can start with you. One of the issues is how difficult it is for individual businesses or organisations to find the correct guidance. And I wonder if I could ask you, start with you and then move to Ms. Spain. What more can the Environment Agency do to make it much easier for people perhaps setting up business for the first time, need to engage with the guidance for the first time, to find everything that they need in one go, and for it not to be such a burden to be constantly seeking out guidance?
I agree. I think a lot of the guidance is very confusing and difficult to follow, and we think it should be rewritten. We started with colleagues in DEFRA on contaminated land last year, and that guidance was a sort of riddle wrapped in an enigma, and it's now been clarified. So that is better.
Clear to me, though.
Yeah.
So it's phrased better, which is good. But is it easy for people to find? Is it easy for somebody who needs to know that guidance to know that they need that guidance and to find it quickly?
We should hear from DEFRA, but what we're trying to do across DEFRA Group is actually make sure that the customer pathways are a bit clearer. That actually we don't just think about you're the customer, so you have to know which one of us you have to ask, but what is the thing you want to do, whether it's because you have a question about an animal, or this question you have about land or about a watercourse, and try and turn that into a much more rational sense of customer journeys. The other thing I think we need to do is a bit more than the guidance. One of the things that's a big source of complaint from people who use our services is that they apply. It's a bit like Mr. Kissack was saying. They apply, and then they're told, well, you didn't apply correctly. Try again. So it's sort of, well, what did I do wrong kind of question. And that is not, I think, acceptable for a modern public service. So what we're trying to do now is reconstruct our forms so they are validated when you're applying. So we know you put the date in correctly, all the questions you need to put in. We can use a lot of AI to help with that, make sure we've corrected those things and check them. So that when you apply, you know you've applied properly, you haven't got that doubt about the process, and that also saves us a lot of time and money as well. The other thing I think that is genuinely difficult is how we deal with bits of the guidance that are very ambiguous and require more of a service approach. I think it was Ms. McKinnell asking about large-scale sites, and that's something we've been worried about. So, give you an example of that. We have a lot of difficulties with contaminated land, where the issue is not so much whether the land should be remediated or not. It's knowing what kind of use is safe in future for that site. So, for example, for a car park, it's completely fine. It's not near a watercourse. Maybe for an allotment, you'd be a bit more concerned. So thinking about trying to understand how that's used. Now, that requires, in the regulator, a level of ability to engage with that stakeholder and applicant, to listen to them, and perhaps take a few risks about settling them. And we've had a few meetings, well, I've had several recently in the last year, where we've had members of Parliament sort of trying to get a pragmatic solution for a site unlocked. And feeling that the regulator is not quite engaging with them in that way. So I think that's something we're trying to fix if we can. And I think we're making some good progress on that. We've got some good examples of it.
Just on that, though, I mean, presumably there's limits to what can be done digitally to fix that, and forms and kind of that very structured approach. Paragraph 12 of the report points out that there have been reductions in local expertise and knowledge within the regulators, which, notwithstanding what you were saying earlier about how many more staff you have than you used to, are they being employed with that kind of direct engagement to kind of try and come up with those more sort of
it's two halves. Right? We've got to think about, for the more straightforward things, I think we're often doing too much regulation. So examples of the sort of category 1 and 2 permits, we're asking ourselves, do we need to permit this, or can we just register it or have a standard rules permit? And early work with the department suggests that maybe 10% of our permits we don't think we actually need. They're not adding any environmental value. They're not very high-risk activities. We could just ask the applicant to let us know what they were doing, and then they'd get their permit automatically. And we can use a lot of AI to accelerate that work, and that would save us money and save us time. Clearly, if you're opening an incinerator or a new landfill or a petrol refinery, there is going to be quite a lot of scrutiny of that proposal, and it is right that we do that thoroughly and in a really clear way. What we're finding at the minute in our operations is that we've had to sort of do more national teams at the higher risk issues. So we've consolidated our teams on COMA, that's the control of major accidents and hazards, on nuclear, and on some of the more high risk waste activities. And then we've got a more area-based model for things like water and land, which are everywhere in that sense. And then I just want to come back to one thing about your very good question on guidance. We're doing an enormous amount of work to make our engagement with farming and farmers better. We've issued all sorts of booklets about preparing for an EA inspection. We've done videos, we've done tours to talk to various farming communities and directly address their fears and concerned about that process. And I think we are incredibly conscious at the EA that if we're going in to talk to a farmer, it's not an oil refinery, it's not a water company. You're sat over someone's kitchen table more often than not, and that is a very different regulatory landscape and needs a different hierarchy of intervention. We're working very closely with my colleagues in Marian's organisation to make sure that we're trying to stitch that together, so if you are a farmer, you feel you get advice and you get suggestions about how you comply. We don't go straight to hard-headed enforcement for people who often don't have many resources to respond to what we're asking them to do.
And Ms. Spain, would you, for Natural England, what more are you doing to make it easier for businesses to engage?
Yeah, I think I might echo some of what Phil's already said. So I think one point is absolutely simplifying the written guidance, making it feel more real, putting more real-life case studies in it. And that matters not just to make it easier for people to understand what they need to do. That also ties in with our move towards having more earned autonomy, allowing people to self-license, self-consent a lot more. If the guidance is clear and the application is simple, it can be automated, and the application barely needs to touch Natural England. People make their own judgment about whether they're complying. So that's how we're moving for the low-risk cases and the cases that perhaps affect small businesses or individual households. At the other end of the spectrum, I think I'd also say it isn't just about getting the guidance right. Paul has already referred to the importance of early engagement in a bigger project, a higher risk or a high opportunity project. So the written guidance, those bigger businesses will probably find it easier to comply and understand the guidance anyway, because they'll have their in-house advisors. So our role there isn't to advise them on how to follow the guidance. Our advice is to work them on finding solutions to some quite tricky issues, such as the type Sally was describing, comes from the infrastructure board. I think the final theme that your question on guidance pulls out, which wasn't perhaps what you were getting at, but I'll mention it anyway in case you were. I think the other thing we are learning through the lead environmental regulator pilot, I visited the Lower Thames Crossing last week with the National Highways Chief Executive, and what we're learning from that is how important that early engagement and that clear pathway is, that clear guidance is, and it is definitely speeding things up, even for a big operator like them. But it is also exposing to us where our own sort of internal wiring is a bit complicated, either within Natural England or particularly in that project between ourselves, Environment Agency and the MMO. So getting the guidance right as a single entity isn't enough. We've also got to look at the guidance we each give and the different processes we all operate together.
Can I make one more point, which is we've done a series of roundtables recently. We had one 2 weeks ago with people who are agents for developers. So these people who are advising or consultancy services and who often have a slightly odd view of the risk, what they need to do, what they don't need to do, and having directly talking to them about this is what we actually need to issue a permit, I think is a very powerful piece of good regulatory practice, and actually means we get better quality applications, it's faster, it's easier for us to process. That's an important element of the picture.
Just finally, you've talked there about sort of big infrastructure projects, you've talked about people who can afford to employ agents. Mm-hmm. I'm really concerned about those smaller businesses, perhaps people setting up for the first time. If you were in their shoes, do you think your organisation would be easy to deal with? And are you thinking about it from that perspective?
I think the examples in that field that Natural England particularly works with are either small developers or individual householders are looking to do work where they might need a protected species licence. So we've already done one major revision to the BAT guidance. We have a thing called the BAT roadmap. Forgive me, it was me that coined it, that name, but we're looking at, over the next 2 years, doing further simplification, making it a lot easier. And one of the systems we're standing up, echoing the point that Phil just made about other parties who are involved, we are making it a lot easier for an ecologist to have earned recognition to issue a licence on Natural England's behalf. So the ecologist is probably out there anyway because the builder has brought them in to advise on issues, and that can be done as one transaction, so Natural England doesn't get involved. We accredit ecologists to issue licences on our behalf.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So it falls to me to ask a few farming questions. So can I come to you, Paul, please? How are you ensuring that environmental regulation of farms does not have an adverse effect on food production?
Yeah. So, as with most of the topics that we've talked about this afternoon, we have to sort of hold two truths that are often in tension at the same time. So the first one is that a key part of DEFRA's role is to support farmers in food production. We want productive, profitable farms producing. I mean, the moment 2/3 of the food we eat in this country is produced by farmers. They are the stewards of 70% of our land. They have an absolutely critical role to play, and part of DEFRA's role is to get alongside them, support them in partnership. Alongside that, the other truth we have to hold is that certain agricultural practices are responsible for a lot of the pollution that we see, environmental pollution that we see. So 40% of the pollution in groundwater and rivers comes from agricultural practices. And actually, the Office of Environmental Protection would say, that their first and final word is always around the importance of addressing pollution from agriculture if we are going to meet our environmental improvement plan targets. So they are the two truths that we have to hold together: the importance of really supporting food production and profitable farming, alongside making sure that agricultural practices shift in a way that meet our environmental targets. We shouldn't always assume they are in conflict, because they are not. There are many practices, agricultural practices, that farmers are taking up increasingly, which are good for both food production and for nature. We all have an interest in the health of soils. For example, healthy soils not only are more fertile and produce better yields, they also absorb more water, thus reducing flood risk, thus reducing pollution, etc., into river courses. And the answer to your question, to some degree, is a mixture of things. So it's not just about regulation. So partly it's about advice. So we advise farmers through our catchment-sensitive farming programme. It's about peer support. So ministers have just announced a £30 million programme to form farmer collaboratives so that we can share good practices across farmers. It's about financial incentives, so the environmental land management schemes, which is our biggest funding from the department, goes to support farmers to do exactly what you're describing, balancing food production and meeting environmental outcomes. And yes, there are regulations as well that we deploy, and advice-led inspections from Phil. So there's a broad range of activity.
So reading into that answer, particularly your statement that DEFRA says 40% of river and groundwater pollution is linked to agricultural practices, may well be true, but clearly some farmers are going to need to radically alter the way that they farm. And it worries me in the next page when I see that you're gearing up to do 6,000 inspections a year by 2029. My calculation, there are 100,000 farmers in this country. That's 1 in 16 farmers can expect, and some of those are very, very small, can expect an inspection every year. Can I ask you whether you will provide enough, and this probably goes to the EA and NE, enough guidance as to how farmers are supposed to comply with these radically altered regulations? Farming is a long-term business. Yep. They can't just change their farming systems overnight. Can you assure this committee that you will allow enough time for that transition to take place?
Well, I might ask Phil to come in on the specific question about the inspections of farms. One of the, I mentioned earlier that there were sort of 10 pieces of guidance which are most used, and that we're revising those. One of those is the farming rules for water. That is therefore, an improved, clearer guidance has been updated with examples. So, we are also we're actually using AI through some of our digital-facing approaches to support farmers to be directed to the right guidance. The nature-friendly advice that we give through our farm catchment service. That's another example of where we're supporting farmers. We have innovation grants as well. I think we're committed to a couple of £100 million worth of innovation grants to support farmers around various practices, some of which, whether that's around covers for slurry, storage, etc., are directly linked to water pollution. So there is a whole range of things we're doing to support, encourage and advise farmers to move in particular directions around nature-friendly farming, alongside the inspections and more enforcement activity that Phil might want to say about the risk-based approach we take on that.
I didn't hear anything in that answer about giving farmers enough time to transition to these new ways of farming. So they've been doing it the same probably for decades, centuries even. And farming is a long-term business. You can't just switch a light switch on and off. It does require time. And I didn't hear anything in your answer to answer that particular question.
I totally agree, but what I would say is we're not about to sort of flip a switch. You know, the work towards nature-friendly farming has been going on for many years, and it will carry on for many years, and more farmers are moving their practices in particular ways, partly supported by our advice, partly supported by the environmental land management schemes. That will need to continue, and we absolutely recognise within the department the farmers need to plan. They need to plan over the longer term. I mentioned earlier, I think I've mentioned a couple of times, the farm roadmap. That will set out more timescales about what we expect to happen when, recognising the importance for farmers to know what is coming down the track in a number of years' time.
You still haven't answered the question. Can I try a third time? Will you allow farmers enough time to transition, given the long-term nature of farming? If you decide to have a fattened beef animal, from sort of conception of that animal to calf to growing it to a fattened beef animal takes at least 2 years. Farmers cannot just switch on and off a light switch. So can I try again for the third time? Will you allow enough time for this transition to take place?
I think what I'm trying to say, Chair, is yes, that is always going to be the principle behind the way in which we change and introduce regulations, and we would set out timetables around individual regulations and including in the farming roadmap.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask you a question, Marian Spain, please? The precautionary principle, and you've already said today that you want people to enhance nature, conservation and so on. Can we be assured that Natural England treats all of those that legally use the countryside equally, farmers, people who enjoy the countryside, shooting fraternity and so on? Can we be absolutely assured that you will regulate them equally and fairly?
Yes. We regulate within the law, we regulate within a framework set by DEFRA. Where we get it wrong, we get that feedback from our customers very clearly. But that is, of course, the principle on which we work.
Thank you. Rupert Lowe, please.
Well, yes, Geoffrey, if I could just very quickly underline what the Chairman says. I'm very concerned. I mean, you say you put food production at the top of your agenda. I don't agree with you. I don't think you do put food production at the top of your agenda. I watch in horror as farms are rewilded. I watch Grade 1 land being given over to beaver rehabilitation schemes and being flooded. I look at the banning of pyrethroid sprays, which means a lot of farms can no longer grow oilseed rape. I look at just about every sort of bit of warmongering on farmers. I mean, farmers are here to produce food. We're an overpopulated island. You talk about biodiversity net gain. A lot of farmers aren't farming now because they're using BNG as a scheme to claim grants. So I don't agree. I think we're not prioritising our food production. And I watch all this with horror while China is mining coal, building railways, taking it down to Beijing and burning it in their fire stations, in their power stations. I see the same in India. So I think we've got the entire emphasis of our nature versus our food production. We're fine as long as the currency holds up. But as we hollow our economy out, eventually the currency collapses and we won't be able to import all the food that we import at the moment. So I'd like you to reassure us that you have got that right, because I don't think you do prioritise food production, Paul. I think you're more interested in the abstracts of rewilding and nature. And I think it's true of the Environment Agency. From what I see, you put in a planning application, you're required to take out loads of land.
Right, come on, we're getting into too many subjects
at once. Can we be reassured that that's the case?
Well, I'm talking about nature-friendly farming. I wasn't actually talking about rewilding. I was talking about nature-friendly farming and the ability to productively grow food in this country whilst also restoring nature, which many thousands of farmers across the country are doing in different ways.
The question, I think, was about food production, though. Are we prioritising it enough?
Well, we will set out in the farming roadmap how we will prioritise food production. We recognise it is absolutely fundamental to our food security and indeed therefore our national security. It is an absolute priority for ministers. They have reinforced that point. The Secretary of State will begin chairing soon a Farming and Food Partnership Board to work with the farming community towards the farming roadmap, setting out what needs to happen and a new vision for farming. Food production is absolutely going to be at the heart of that. It is also true, alongside that, that we have a set of environmental targets, legislative targets that we need to meet, and as this report says, make further progress on. Our job as a government is to make sure that we are achieving both of those objectives.
I think we do need to make sure we look after that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think Anna wants.
Anna, yes, please.
Yes, just a small supplementary on this. I have a lot of sympathy for my farmers and my colleagues who are farmers. Already have a very long list of regulators that they have to engage with. Environment Agency, obviously Natural England, the Food Standards Agency, the Animal and Plant Health Agency, the Rural Payments Agency, and so on. Are we going to be adding another regulator to this list with the new water regulator? And the reason I ask is you've made the point yourself, Paul, that a large proportion of water pollution, does also, and we've talked about sewage, but also comes from agricultural runoff. So in unifying the water regulation and taking some of the EA functions across, Are we then expecting that farms are also going to be having to meet these regulations with the new water regulator? And I'll start with that, and I may ask a follow-up, depending on the answer.
Well, the net effect in terms of the number of regulators would be to reduce the number of regulators. If you're folding in the drinking water regulator and Ofwat together and parts of NE and EA, so the overall number of regulators, quite how different sectors will need to interact with different regulators, I would need to step back and think through that. I think it's certainly plausible what you're saying, that farmers would need to engage with the new regulator. As always with this question, it is therefore then how do we make sure these regulators are working more closely together so that they are providing a better sort of user interface for their customers, whoever they are, whether they're farmers or anywhere else.
I do worry because I'm specifically thinking of farms. It's clear that the water sector will be under this new one regulator. But
and the regulator will cover the water system, not just the water sector, so you're quite right.
Indeed. But, and this may be one for Mr. Duffy, if the Environment Agency is also concerned about soil health as well as water health, maybe the same agricultural practices are affecting both soil and water. So will we just be moving the fragmentation to a different place as some of your EA functions on water move into the new water regulator, but some of the functions that farmers will have to address for some of their agricultural practices that may also contaminate soil as well as water because it's runoff. I'm just worried that we're creating, in trying to simplify things, new complexities for farmers.
I mean, in a way, the structure of the Environment Agency and what happens with the regulator is above my pay grade, so I don't know.
Okay.
But what I do know is that if you're starting to regulate the water industry or think about pollution sources, you do have to take an overall view. And the bit of the kind of review I'm very supportive of, I think my colleagues are as well, is that at the start of each price review, you need to set out what kind of environmental outcomes you want to have, as well as the economic, security, supply and bill outcomes. And that hasn't been happening consistently. The Environment Agency has not got a document that covers that. Neither does Ofwat. And I think it would be a very good thing at the next price review if we did have a sense of what the priorities were. So going back to our earlier exchange with Dixon, do we think that phosphorus matters? And how much does it matter vis-a-vis nitrogen, for example? You were mentioning the wharf. On the wharf for the bathing water, the principal source is actually farming practices in those areas. So if you were thinking about getting that bathing water to a better condition, it would be a range of interventions on the catchment, and some of them would be with farms.
Yep.
So I think this logic of thinking as a system as a whole, as it was saying, is a very strong logic. And speaking parochially between myself and the interim head of Ofwat, we are quite keen to have a mock-up of what such a strategy would look like so we can test it and people can see how that would change regulatory decisions over time. I think that's a very good idea.
And can we make sure then, Mr. Kissack, that as you do develop the transition plan for the new regulator, that this issue of farms and, where their practices will be covered as part of a water system, as opposed to their agricultural practices that may be covered or remain with the Environment Agency, are clearly defined?
Yeah, I think you're raising a good and important point. I'm very happy to take that away and make sure we reflect on that.
When, Paul, do we think we'll get absolute clarity as to how the water industry is to be regulated and which bits, presumably the water bits of the EA, will go into that new organisation? When will we all be given clarity on exactly how it's all going to work?
Well, the white paper provided some clarity, and the transition plan, which is due to be published in coming months, will provide further clarity, and in due course the primary legislation that we hope to lay will get into the real detail of it.
Thank you. Chris, please.
Yes, so I have a series of questions concerning data and information and the IT platform. So in the NO report, paragraph 10, it indicates that each of you are going through a process of transformation. I think the EA is ahead of the curve in sense of the report that we've seen. DEFRA has a series of legacy IT platforms, I think, which were raised in 2023, I think, by this committee and others. So what I'm after is an update on where you are in relation to your IT transformation programme, and included within that the headcount that you've allocated to that, where that sits within your organisational organogram, so whether that sits at director level from a programme change perspective or beneath someone else, and any resource or challenges that you might have experienced, given the fact your budgets are increasing.
Yep. So I'm not sure I'll be going to be able to give you the headcount numbers, but let me try and answer most of your questions if I can. So our starting point, as you say, is that historically every part of the DEFRA group, every individual organisation developed its own IT systems and indeed its own data systems. And over recent years what we have tried to do is pull all of those together into a centralised approach. When the NEO looked at this in 2023, I think they rightly identified us as having one of the largest legacy IT that's across different government departments. And I think historically there have been three barriers that have got in the way of us improving that. One is investment, which you allude to, a sort of lack of sustained investment over time into our IT systems. The second has been around skills, and the third actually has been around common data standards. My sense is, again, a bit like the earlier conversation on regulation more generally, if I look back at the NAO report and where we're at now, I think we've made quite a bit of progress, but there's a heck of a long way to go still. I think it's worth thinking about three areas where we've got work going on. So the first is the legacy IT programme that you mentioned. I think we identified about 300 high-risk applications that needed to be remediated, and we've done over 200 of them. We've got about 18 months left, I think, before we've got to a point where we can basically say we have sorted out those 300, and we've closed down some high-risk data centres. So good progress. This is the unglamorous bit of IT work, is just really sorting out and remediating your legacy IT. The second is more around service transformation work, where again we have done quite a lot. I think we've improved quite a lot of our online services. I was just reflecting on the questions that Ms. Olney was asking earlier about our engagement with customers. We now have actually some online services which are rated excellent by the Government Digital Service, which certainly wouldn't have been before they had been changed. We have a service optimisation team who go in and support the regulators and other arm's length bodies with their service redesign around digital. We've got some big new digital systems coming online, particularly supporting things like the extended producer responsibility. Phil might want to talk about the regulated services platform, because that is actually our, in some ways, our biggest and most relevant for this committee, digital transformation. So we've got a sort of digital transformation portfolio in addition to the legacy. And then the third area is actually around AI and new cutting edge technologies, where I think we are making I think we have about 20 different pilots going on across the group in the use of AI. Some of those are around service efficiency, so they're about chatbots, etc. So a chatbot for farmers to help them locate the right guidance to Ms. Olney's points, things like that. Some of them are actually interesting around our core business. So we have AI for peat, for example, which is using machine learning on satellite imagery to look at peatland features and drainage, so that people can then go out and help to re-wet peatland. So quite creative uses of AI. And that's therefore the full gamut of digital, from remediating old legacy IT right through to using cutting edge. How are we getting on? I've given you a sense of we're doing well, I think. I noticed the NAO report says it's gone slower than it should. I think that's probably fair as well. It needs to accelerate over the coming years. We've got the money to do that. I think we'll be investing in the region of about 800 million per year over the spending review period, through a mix of run costs and cybersecurity plus transformation. It's run from a central digital and data team that supports the whole group, so it's supporting 30,000 people across the group rather than each arm's length body having their own team. we could come on to data as well, but I'm conscious I'm giving a very long answer. But the progress has been made as well in terms of common data standards, which is obviously really important to underpin these kind of changes.
I want to test all that answer, please. It sounds as though a lot of progress is being made, although it's very easy to remediate some of the systems. It'll be much harder, I suspect, to remediate some of the other ones.
Yeah.
This committee has done a lot of work on this whole area. One of the recommendations we've consistently made is to have a chief digital information officer at a very senior level in each department, and to have a highly skilled digital person on the non-executive board.
Yep.
Do you have both those?
Yes, we do. So we have a director level GDIO. Actually, a new one, an interim one, started today. So actually, we'll be going out to recruit for a new GDIO as well. We also actually have a vacancy of a chief operating officer coming up, and one of the opportunities for me there is to bring in somebody at that level, an even higher level, with digital experience given. And I think that is something I would be looking for in an ideal candidate, given the importance of digital transformation for the group. We may not get that, and I've got a strong GDIO as well. And yes, we have a non-executive director who is a specialist in digital too.
That's very encouraging indeed. Marian, can I ask you, because Philip made a great play earlier on about how he was improving his IT systems. How are you getting on improving yours?
So I think the NEO report sets out very fairly where Natural England is. So over the last spending review, we had significant investment in our legacy systems, that ones, for example, that hold data on condition of sites and species. They matter because it's not just Natural England that rely on those, third parties rely on them as well. So that was an important priority to make sure those existing data systems remained fit for purpose. And we also invested in where we needed a new system. So, for example, the off-site register for BNG. I think we are hoping in the next spending review we'll be able to mirror more what our colleagues have done in the Environment Agency and really start to fundamentally reform some of our regulatory systems. I think, first of all, linked to the guidance point, as I said, the guidance point isn't just what the law says, it's to lead you to get through the process more readily. So we're looking to invest in more customer-facing regulatory systems that allow people to self-serve a lot easier. We're also looking to invest in AI so that our own staff can better handle the very wide range of data we're using. So the quicker they can gather that data, the better they're able to make a judgment, noting that data isn't all held in our systems. And I think the third thing we're keen to focus on is having better understanding of our customers. I mentioned already the Lead Environmental Regulator programme is showing just how complex that when many regulators are working on the same project, we can't currently at the moment all have a look and see what each other are doing, and I think that would make a significant difference. So I think we're slightly behind the curve on digital, but I think we will be prioritising.
Are you working on, between the three of you, all
yes.
your systems communicating properly with each other?
Yes, definitely
Yes.
on the regulatory processes side. I think that is a shared ambition, because that means we can better manage those interfaces and the customers can see which of us they need to deal with.
Okay, Rupert Lowe, please.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. This is a question, really, I think, for Philip and Marian. I mean, given my somewhat hackneyed view of DEFRA, my experience of DEFRA over my 40 years of farming, I think the question is for you two. I mean, what do you need from DEFRA to be able to effectively work more effectively together? What do you need, Philip, and what do you need, Marian? So tell the committee, what do you need that you're not getting at the moment?
Well, first of all, on data and digital, I think we are very well joined up across DEFRA Group. As Paul has said, we have a central function, and we're trying to build things that are generic and modular so that you can take a billing system or a document management system or a mapping system from the EA system and give it to the MMO or to Natural England. That's the fastest way of getting functionality across the group as a whole, and the best way of doing it and the cheapest way of doing it. That, I think, is really, and what we need from DEFRA is to set the kind of standards and rules. So the data standards, the metadata are all clear. What's a farm? Which farm is it? What's the geography going to be? I think the second thing I would say is obviously a lot of priorities for DEFRA, you know, SPS agreement on things going on across those areas. There are some areas of legislation which we do need to see prioritised. The one I would say is carrier broker dealer regulation in waste, because I think we're all conscious of the fact that that is a loophole through which criminals can enter the waste system, and that is what is causing some of these problems we're seeing in places like Kidlington. That is really urgent, and we've got a clear plan for it. We need to do it now. And I think there's some really good joint work been going on the deregulatory side. So working through all the SIs we'd need to give us the power to give exemptions from permitting. We've done some for waste so far. Paul, you mentioned the work we're doing on industrial installations. We've actually got a list of 10 areas we want to look at. That, I think, is really important, giving that kind of focused attention. So that is all really positive. And I think the last thing I'd say is, as a manager of the EA, we need clear targets. We do need clear targets and performance metrics from our sponsor department. And we also need some flexibility to get on and deliver them. And what we saw this year, actually, really positively, was the withdrawal of some ring fences from DEFRA. And that is actually raising in a report. That's given us much more flexibility. Now we're held to account performance on what we need to do, how many inspections, what did you deliver, and we're not sort of tied up in knots with sort of a lot of bureaucracy on our money flows. That's been a really important step forward. So a few things there to suggest.
And I risk repeating you, Phil, so I'll be brief. I think top of my list is something we've talked about a lot already this afternoon, about that clarity of the parameters within which we're working, that clear guidance, that clear framework, and that openness to be willing to see. I think what we're looking at, how far can we go with guidance and ministerial direction, and where might we need to reform legislation. We've already had a significant legislative reform in the Planning and Infrastructure Act, so I think we've got plenty to be going on with there, but looking ahead 2 or 3 years' time, I think we need an honest conversation about that. We've talked about digital already. Natural England hadn't had a major investment, but we are expecting one next year. And I think the other one is a version of what you said, Phil. I think the other thing that will really make a difference for us is the DEFRA outcomes framework, and the environmental improvement plan makes it much clearer what we're aiming for. And as we begin to work with DEFRA to develop the delivery pathways, that will help us understand what we must prioritise. We have, of the 600 in DEFRA, we have 200 within Natural England. We simply can't do everything everywhere all at once, and that ability to understand where we're going to make the biggest impact and where our different choices of what we do and the extent to which we do it, the clarity on that will help. And linked to that, I think, again, it's been a topic we've talked about already, that longer-term trajectory for farming and where we need to get with farmers, the need for food security, the need for resilience in farm businesses, and the need to be clear on the environmental outcomes society now needs of farmers. I think that will help us prioritise as well.
Okay, so how then can we be assured? I mean, as a farmer, we fill in countless forms. I often think we're asked for data all the time, which we still have to fill in, I guess, because governments, once they've got a department that asks the questions, that department churns out the same questions every year, even though you've got your arable area aid claims and you've got loads of data elsewhere. Yep. So how soon are you all going to be able to digitally communicate with each other so there isn't extra burden on the people you're regulating? Because I have a view that most farmers actually have been extremely good sort of tenants of their land. They've looked after it, it's been passed down, we have a wonderful countryside, and it's, goodness knows, how did we survive before all of you lot were regulating us? And most farmers are not terrorists. They love their farms. They don't want to do them any damage. They're basically driven to produce food. So I want to know, Paul, I mean, you've heard what was said. What are you going to do to help them? Because it seems to me you've all got to get together. I think you all trip over each other far too much. I think there's far too much sort of lack of clarity.
Yeah.
How are you going to deal with that?
Well, just to reassure you on one point, that DEFRA has a positive view of farmers. I live in a farming community in North Yorkshire. That's where I'll be going home to tonight.
It's not always evident.
Well,
I have to say.
I hope it becomes.
I don't think the farmers would agree with you.
Well, I hope it becomes more evident over time. I'd also say on one of your specific points about the amount of data we collect. I mentioned earlier that we're doing a review on precisely that. Why are we collecting so much data from farmers? And if part of the answer is that actually we're collecting it in duplicate and we should be sharing it more, then hopefully that will be one of the conclusions and we can get on with it. I think we're already sharing much more data than we used to, but as with the rest of this conversation, that is progress made, but much, much more to do. So I think that is a point fairly made.
Now you're talking about diversity in the countryside, I saw this morning in the Daily Telegraph, but I think you've got better things to concentrate on, frankly. But anyway,
so we're getting out of scope. All right. Thank you very much. Clive Betts, please.
Right. What are the concerns you have about skills going forward that you haven't got that you will need, and whether you can easily recruit them? Philip, Marian?
Shall I go first? So I think there was a comment made earlier. I think think it was you, Mr. Betts, forgive me, we've talked about a lot this afternoon. I think about whether we have enough people, whether we have a too high turnover, and that's the thing. Our turnover on paper is relatively low. We have about a 6-7% turnover in Natural England. So quite a lot of people stay with us for a very long time because they're very driven by our agenda. They find it a very rewarding career. However, there are 2 or 3 areas where we do struggle to retain people and we sometimes struggle to recruit. And they're particularly important at the moment because they're in the issue about planning, particularly in the marine environment. So we are looking at how we can bolster our planning professions, not necessarily through trying to compete with pay, because we simply can't, but what we're looking at is how do we give our planning professionals feels a more rewarding career, including through that sort of collaboration and partnership I was working with. So that's my biggest concern on skills, how to retain people who can engage at a professional level in the planning system.
So is it just retain or is it recruiting in the first place?
It's a little bit of both, but of course the two are linked. So when people, if they want to apply for a job here, if we can show them what their career pathway will be, what professional skills they'll grow. Perhaps to give you an example, we're talking to some of the major offshore wind developers, and they are sometimes one of our competitors. And what we've understood is it simply doesn't help if they try and recruit our expert staff. So we're looking at not just working together more as a team on a piece of case, we're also looking at whether we can give our staff and their staff the opportunity to move in and out of private and public sector jobs as part of a training programme, which also has the benefit of we understand each other's worlds better, we're more likely to empathise.
But that's going to be challenging if the pay levels are
yes,
really different.
Yes, it would be. I'm trying not to use the word apprenticeship because it might not necessarily be an entry-level person who's doing that, but it would be within that sort of philosophy. You're employed by one person through your career, but you can work on as a secondment, perhaps think of it in those terms.
How far advanced is that thinking?
It's being planned. We've been talking to the offshore wind developers for the last 6 months, and there's a plan in hand.
No, I think this is a constant problem. You can't compete with private sector salaries. You've got to look at the offer as a whole. And you sometimes have to grow your own. If you're a big organisation, you sort of have to kind of take that on the chin and work out what you're going to do about these skills. So we have got what we call market forces factors for 6 roles which are particularly hard to fix or grow your own quickly. So, for example, we have one for the nuclear and radiological regulators. That's cut our vacancy rate from about a third of our jobs to about 6% of our jobs. That's helped us quite a lot. But we're also very focused on what we can do as an employer to reach hard-to-reach groups, people right around the country. So last year we had 17 staff join us on industry placements. They were often young workers in key industries we work with. We offered 27 new grads joined our engineering and science training scheme. We've already got 40 people on there. And we also have an engineer graduate training programme that can take you all the way from 16 through a degree apprenticeship all the way to chartered status. It's very unusual across that. And we've got a big partnership with the ICE Institute of Civil Engineers for doing that. We brought in 250 people into our water company compliance training programme, and we've got a partnership with Cranfield University and also Teesside University, and we're looking for more partnerships around the country with higher education establishments who can help us get hard to reach talent, particularly in places that are maybe not obvious for graduate recruitment. One of the things about the EA is we're unusual. We've got jobs everywhere, quite high-skilled jobs everywhere. And therefore, I think it's particularly important for us that we're reaching those communities. We formed a partnership with National Highways, and we're looking very hard at whether we can get harder-to-reach talent groups, people who haven't worked previously, people who perhaps have been out of the workplace for many years. Can we get them into work? Can we use that as a way of getting more people? And can we get children who might not think about going to university to come and join a degree apprenticeship with us, maybe from a more deprived community, and stay with us long term in that area and get all their qualifications right up to master's level and beyond? So I think we're quite excited about the opportunities there. I think there's a lot we could do. I also think it's our responsibility as an environment agency to be in those communities and doing that work. And you know, we're all ears for ideas about what we could do to do more outreach of that sort. So,
apprenticeships, do you already use those?
Yeah, we do have some. Let me see how many we had last year. We had 27 recruits last year. We've also got 38 people who are on sandwich courses, so they're doing a 1-year period with us as part of their degree.
Isn't one of the problems that the public sector is obviously often very good at bringing people in at that level, giving them really good training, and then as soon as they get really useful and competent,
they can get paid more outside. Is that a challenge?
It's a huge. We lose people in mid-career, right? When they got families, they want to buy a house, they leave us, and then often they come back later after a period in the private sector. I don't think that's necessarily unhealthy. I think it's quite good to have people who've worked in different sectors come and leave the organisation and come back. But you are right, there is a problem there. What I do not think is acceptable, and I think it's an issue which I think this committee will take quite a strong focus at, is a kind of bidding war within the public sector. And we have seen that in things like nuclear, lawyers, a few areas. There is a very good initiative by the nuclear departments to bring more people into nuclear and also manage that. So we're not just seeing a sort of circuit of people going from one department to another, seeking higher pay. That is something we have to be very, very attentive to. We've recently changed our grading structure for lawyers to make sure we're not just moving lawyers between DEFRA Group and the EA. That I think is also quite important. So there's a few areas in particular where I think we have to be quite attentive to that risk.
Both you probably come to the permanent secretary as well. IT. We talked to quite a lot of permanent secretaries and others in hearings, and often IT skills and the pay that people can get in the private sector as an alternative is a real challenge. And sometimes the rigidity of the pay frameworks in organisations stops people with particular skills that are needed being paid more. Are you restricted in that way? Do you pay more for those particular skills?
So digital skills are centralised within DEFRA. So I mentioned earlier, actually, if there was one area that, I mean, there are others that I could point to, like vets and lawyers, and specialist skills that are really important to us driving our reform programme. But digital skills are always something that we need. I mean, interestingly, over the last few years, we've moved from a position where I think around about a quarter of all of our digital staff were contingent labour using a lot of agencies, to a point where now I think it's about 97% in-house. Now, actually, if anything, that's a little bit high, and we want to sort of lower it a bit to create a bit more flex. But it does suggest we have been bringing in digital skills reasonably successfully. One of the other challenges on digital skills is not just about the specialist digital skills that you want in the central functions that are shaping your digital. You actually want digital skills across your workforce, because quite a lot of the transformative work that we've just been talking about requires a level of digital literacy across your wider workforce. So that's one of our sort of challenges as well.
Just
Right. Well, you go on.
I was
Last question.
Ask about, you mentioned agency and the reduction in the number of agency staff. Is that the case in the two agencies, that agency staff, it's a different word, agency staff are actually falling in terms of the percentage of your workforce?
We are very focused on reducing our reliance on contingent labour in our major project portfolio. And that is because we found, and help from the NAO has helped highlight this, that actually too often the internal capacity of the organisation to understand its own programmes and coordinate all of these suppliers was too weak. And actually you need to have more in-house capacity that stays long-term with these projects. So we are rebalancing. There is a role for contingent labour, particularly in highly specialised areas. Archaeology is a good example. But also for more routine project management and kind of management of risk in these projects and engineering roles, we feel we need a bit more in-house and a bit less outsourced. It's cheaper too.
So I'm desperate to finish this hearing because the clock is ticking. I need to just finally finish up with planning and talk to you, please, Philip, if I may. Nothing enrages my constituents more than to see a planning application when they know there's already a problem of discharging wastewater, and they don't see the Environment Agency coming in to give the local authority any advice on that application. Can you tell us, we've got a long letter from DEFRA about the changes due to the water regulations, exactly how you're going to monitor planning applications?
Yes, I can. So we have made two big interventions in planning by objecting to housing applications. One was in Oxford. It was a set of objections because we were concerned about the state of the Oxford sewage treatment works, and the other was around Cambridge for water supply, so a separate set of issues. To our knowledge, we've only done that in those two locations. It's not currently a routine element of our work, and we did it because we felt that something had gone very wrong with the regulation, particularly in Oxford. So, as you will know, the situation at Oxford was that the sewage treatment works had been funded in what was called AMP7. So that was the previous price review, so it should have been upgraded. The house builder then proceeded along the pace already previously planned for, but Thames Water had not in fact upgraded the wastewater treatment plant. That then meant that under the Water Framework Directive there was a risk of deterioration in the Upper Thames catchment, and that was on that basis that we objected. We did so really because that's not how it's supposed to work, but we had to do something, and actually it brought people to the table. We managed to come up with a solution to get the sewage treatment work upgraded more generally. We would not want to be in that situation again. We would want to make sure, firstly, that there were sensible, credible housing projections going into the water resource management plans and also the wastewater management plans. Secondly, that companies do what they are funded to do in the price review. And actually, with thanks to DEFRA College, we've got a much more invasive monitoring system between us and Ofwat to make sure they are building on time the things they have promised to do. And then we would hope we would not be in a situation where Housebuilder was running ahead of the provision of essential wastewater treatment plants. And we're looking very carefully at things like the Oxford-Cambridge growth area to make sure that the housing numbers and projections are stable and credible in that process.
One way of doing this is not to wait for the individual planning application, but to look at the local plan process.
Yes.
For example, Tewkesbury, Cheltenham and Gloucester are working on a current local plan which is envisaging 40,000 new houses in the next 20 years. Now you're presumably going to need to intervene in that to make sure that A, there's enough fresh water, and B, that the wastewater is going to be disposed of properly. So how are you engaging with the local plan process?
Yes, so we are not consulted on all of these plans. Our role as a formal consultee is limited to certain circumstances. Flood, you'll be aware of that, but also mining and a few other coma and so on. Essentially, though, if you think about that proposal, that's 20 years of housing growth across Tewkesbury and Gloucestershire. That's 4 price reviews that we'd have to go through. That's 4 sets in the current law of water resource management plans and wastewater management plans. And you would expect there to be the regulators to align the numbers with the plans. Now, that has not always happened, and you'll note things like Bath, where they did not upgrade the wastewater treatment plant for the growth in the university population. We had to step in there. But our thinking behind that is to make sure they're coherent. Now, in the context of Cunliffe, he proposes a simplification of this system. And DEFRA have also clarified what the fallback needs to be if there is no local plan agreed in a certain area, which I think is a healthy set of arrangements to make sure we've got more credible numbers. But you're completely right that if you saw a massive leap in numbers that could outpace the speed of Ofwat and the EA in adjusting the investment plans, we would have a problem. I'm sceptical that you'll get that many houses built faster than 5 years, though.
Okay. You two agencies are presumably your people are looking at the same planning applications. Surely there's much more synergy that could be done between the 2 agencies, one person looking at the plans rather than 2.
I think possibly. I think certainly our people don't look at the plans in isolation. I think you're just reflecting your previous point. Your point is very well made. We are spending more of our time now looking at the plan than individual projects, because if we can design the problems out soon enough, we don't then need to intervene in individual cases. And at that planning level, we certainly have our teams. At a local level, as Phil's already said, we both have staff who are based locally, live in those communities, and they work pretty closely together on planning, strategic planning in particular. And the reforms that are coming in to bring in the new spatial development strategy, I think that will add even more weight to having plans that consider impacts at a strategic level much earlier, so the conflicts are dealt with in the plan.
I mean, simple things like having common maps, for example, that simply helps, right? The data is the same. We don't need to constantly resurvey it. We know the situation.
So, Paul Phillips just said he's not a statutory consultee in every local plan making strategic. Why not, and why can't he be given those powers?
I might look to Sally, who's a bit more expert in the planning system than I am, to try and have a go at that question. But just to pick up this point about join up between the 2 and actually link back to our digital conversation earlier, one of the things in our digital transformation programme coming up is around terrestrial planning and infrastructure, to bring these systems together so we have a one view from DEFRA in a way that we haven't in the past.
Just on statutory consultees, obviously our regulators are statutory consultees where they have a particular role in the process, so the Environment Agency for flood and Marian's team for nature. It is the water companies who are the consultees on water supply, but that doesn't mean that the Environment Agency don't get involved, and they have a really important role in the process. It's just not always as a statutory consultee.
Okay. Final question from me. I didn't have to try very hard, and I came up with 9 reasons why the EA and NE shouldn't be merged together. After you're merging the water sector together, why is the EA and National England not being merged together? And I've got 9 very good reasons here. I won't read them out because I want to finish this hearing.
Why they should or should not?
Well,
Yep.
9
Why-
reasons why they
should be merged together.
Should.
Oh, okay.
Should be merged together.
Yeah.
Well, so what we want to do is make the system work better, and to do that quickly. And you need to set a very high bar for a decision that what you need to do is a structural change of any sort. Now, what we've decided as a government is that that bar is met when it comes to the water system for the reasons we were talking about earlier, that basically the system of regulation we have in water is sufficiently broken that the best way is to sort of start again, as it were, and sort of with a new single regulator across that system. I don't think that is the case when we come to the regulations that we've been talking about today. I think there are things that we need to get better, in some cases a lot better. Hopefully we've had a good conversation about that. But I think the idea of a structural change would be quite a big distraction, and I think actually the challenge is with how we focus on the underlying legislation and regulation and continue to iterate that and improve our customer services and our guidance and the way in which we work. There is a challenge for us to join up, not in a structural way but in a ways of working way. If we can achieve that, we can make much faster progress on the agenda that we've been describing today.
So thank you very much for all your evidence this afternoon. If you're not going to merge them, we will keep a very close eye on DEFRA to make sure that they are cooperating together better, and they are living up to the very high expectations which you have given them this afternoon, and you're going to give them very, very clear remits as to what they both asked for. So thank you all for your evidence this afternoon, much appreciated. Or an uncorrected version of the transcript will be available in the coming days. We will be looking at your evidence very carefully, coming up with recommendations, which I hope you'll look at equally carefully. Order. Thank you.